See? Eh? There we go. Okay. Alright. Hold on. I need to turn down my... There we go. So... Alright. So... Before I don't know how to explain this, but I said last year I was going to read this book because I found the first and third book at Goodwill, and I bought the second book off of eBay, so I thought I'd read these books for Halloween. So I got the first one and the third one from Goodwill, and I got the second one from eBay to complete it. And obviously, it's a book based off of the Five Nights at Freddy's video game series, and for this live stream, I'm going to read the first 3 chapters, and then after that, I'm going to do something else, because I want to try to cram in as much content on my YouTube channel as possible, because it's going to be a rough week this week. Alright? So... What do you mean, go live? I'm already live. Oh, I forgot to check my phone. Okay. There we go. Hi, Waz. So... Okay, so... Hello, Rama. So... Yeah, I'm gonna read the first 3 chapters of this book to you guys, and, we'll see, and I'll figure out something else in the meantime. So, alright, Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed-Wrisley. So, it's my first time reading this book. So I'm only gonna, for this stream, I'm only gonna read the first 3 chapters. Sorry, I just got distracted by the legal. Okay, Chapter 1. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She was wedged behind a row of arcade games, cramped in the crawl space between the consoles and the wall, tangled electrical cords and useless plugs strewn beneath her. She was cornered. The only way out was past the thing, and she wasn't fast enough to make it. She could see him stalking back and forth, catching flickers of movement through the gaps between the games. There was scarcely enough room to move, but she tried to crawl backward. Her foot caught on a cord. She stopped, confronting herself to carefully dislodge it. She heard the clash of metal on metal, and the farthest console rocked back against the wall. He hit it again, shattering the display. Then attacked the next, crashing against them almost rhythmically, tearing through the machinery, coming closer. I have to get out. I have to. The panic thought was of no help. There was no way out. Her arm ached, and she wanted to sob aloud. Blood soaked through the tattered bandage, and it seemed as though she could feel it draining out of her. The console a few feet away crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. He was getting closer. She could hear the grinding of gears and the clicking of servos even louder. Eyes closed, she could still see the way he looked at her. See the matted fur and the exposed metal beneath the synthetic flesh. Suddenly, the console in front of her was wrenched away. It toppled over, thrown down like a toy. The power cords beneath her and her hands and knees were yanked away, and Charlie slipped, almost falling. She caught herself and looked up just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. A hook. Must be Foxy then. Welcome to Hurricane, Utah. Charlie smiled wearily at the sign and kept driving. The world didn't look any different from one side of the sign to the other, but she felt a nervous anticipation as she passed it. She didn't recognize anything. Then again, she hadn't really expected to, not this far at the edge of town where it was all highway and empty space. She wondered what the others would look like, who they were now. 10 years ago, they'd been best friends, and then it happened. And everything ended, at least for Charlie. She hadn't seen any of them since she was 7 years old. They had written all the time as kids, especially Marla, who wrote like she talked, fast and incoherent. But as they got older, they had grown apart. The letters had grown fewer and further between, and the conversations leading up to this trip had been perfunctory and full of awkward pauses. Charlie repeated their names as though to reassure herself that she still remembered them. Marla, Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, John, and Michael. Michael was the reason for this trip, after all. It was 10 years since he died, 10 years since it happened, and now his parents wanted them all together for the dedication ceremony. They wanted all his old friends there when they announced the scholarship they were creating in his name. Charlie knew it was a good thing to do, but the gathering still felt slightly macabre. She shivered and turned down the air conditioning, even though she knew it was not that cold. As she drove into the town center, Charlie began to reorganize things. A few stores and the movie theater. A few stores and the movie theater, which was now advertising the summer's blockbuster hit. She felt a brief moment of surprise, then smiled at herself. What did you expect? That the whole place would be unchanged? A monument to the moment of your departure, frozen forever in July 1985. Well, that was exactly what she had expected. She looked at her watch. Still a few hours to kill before they all meet up. She thought about going to the movie, but she knew what she really wanted to do. Charlie made a left turn and headed out of town. 10 minutes later, she pulled to a stop and got out. The house loomed up before her, its dark outline a wound in the bright blue sky. Charlie leaned back against the car, slightly dizzy. She took a moment to steady herself with deep breaths. She had known it would be here. An illicit look through her aunt's bank books a few years before had told her that the mortgage was paid off and that Aunt Jen was still paying property taxes. It had only been 10 years. There was no reason it should have changed at all. Charlie climbed the steps slowly, taking in the peeling paint. The third stair still had a loose board, and the rose bushes had taken over one side of the porch, their thorns biting hungrily into the wood. The door was locked, but Charlie still had her key. She had never actually used it, as she took it from around her neck and slid it into the lock. She remembered her father putting its chain around her neck, in case you ever need it. Well, she needed it now. The door opened easily, and Charlie looked around. She didn't remember much about the first couple of years here. She had been only 3 years old, and all the memories had faded together in the blur of a child's grief and loss, of not understanding why her mother had to go away, clinging to her father every moment, not trusting the world around her, unless he was there, unless she was holding tightly to him, burying herself in his flannel shirts and the smell of grease and hot metal and him. The stairs stretched straight up in front of her, but she did not move directly to them. Instead, she went into the living room, where all the furniture was still in place. She had not really noticed it as a child, but the house was a little too large for the furniture they had. Things were spread out too widely in order to fill the space. The coffee table was too far from the couch to reach. The easy chair too far across the room to carry on a conversation. There was a dark stain in the wooden floorboards near the center of the room. Charlie stepped around it quickly and went to the kitchen, where the cupboards held only a few pots, pans, and dishes. Charlie had never felt a lack of anything as a child, but it seemed now that the unnecessary enormity of the house was a sort of apology, the attempt of a man who had lost so much to give his daughter what he could. He'd always had a way of overdoing whatever he did. The last time she was here, the house had been dark and everything felt wrong. She was carried up the stairs to her bedroom, although she was 7 years old, and could have gone quicker on her own 2 feet. But Aunt Jen had stopped on the front porch, picked her up, and carried her, shielding her face as though she were a baby in the glaring sun. In her room, Aunt Jen set Charlie down and closed the bedroom door behind them. She told her to pack her suitcase, and Charlie had cried because all her things could never fit into the small case. We can come back for the rest later, Aunt Jen said, her impatience leaking through as Charlie hovered indecisively at her dresser, trying to decide which t-shirts to bring along. They had never come back for the rest. Charlie mounted the stairs, heading to her old bedroom. The door was partially cracked, and she opened it. She had a giddy feeling of displacement. And as she opened it, she had a giddy feeling of displacement, as though her younger self might be sitting there among her toys. Might look up and ask Charlie, "Who are you?" Charlie went in. Like the rest of the house, her bedroom was untouched. The walls were pale pink, and the ceiling, which sloped dramatically on one side to follow the line of the roof, was painted to match. Her old bed still stood against the wall beneath a large window. The mattress was still intact, though the sheets were gone. The window was cracked slightly open, and rotting lace curtains wavered in the gentle breeze from outside. There was a dark water stain in the paint beneath the window where the weather had gotten in over the years, betraying the house's neglect. Charlie climbed onto the bed and forced the window shut. It obeyed with a screech, and Charlie stepped back and turned her attention to the rest of the room, to her father's creations. Their first night in the house, Charlie had been afraid to sleep alone. She did not remember the night, but her father had told her about it often enough that the story had taken on the quality of memory. She sat up and wailed until her father came to find her, until he scooped her up and held her and promised her he would make sure she was never alone again. The next morning, he took her by the hand and led her to the garage, where he set to work keeping that promise. The first of his inventions was a purple rabbit, now gray with age from years of sitting in the sunlight, probably Bonnie. Her father had named him Theodore. Theodore? Never mind then. He was the size of a 3-year-old child, her size at the time, and he had plush fur, shining eyes, and a dapper red bow tie. He didn't do much, only waved a hand, tilted his head to the side, and said in her father's voice, "I love you, Charlie." But it was enough to give her a night watcher, someone to keep her company when she could not sleep. Right now, Theodore sat in a white wicker chair in the far corner of the room. Charlie waved at him, but not activated, he did not wave back. After Theodore, the toys got more complex. Some worked and some did not. Some seemed to have permanent glitches, while others simply did not appeal to Charlie's childish imagination. She knew her father took those back to his workshop and recycled them for parts, though she did not like to watch them be dismantled. But the ones that were kept, those she loved, they were here now, looking at her expectantly. Smiling, Charlie pushed a button beside her bed. It gave way stiffly, but nothing happened. She pushed it again, holding it down longer, and this time across the room, and with the weary creak of metal on metal, the unicorn began to move. The unicorn, Charlie had named him Stanley for some reason she could no longer remember, was made of metal and had been painted glossy white. He trundled around the room on a circular track, bobbing his head stiffly up and down. The track squealed as Stanley rounded the corner and came to a stop beside the bed. Charlie knelt beside him on the floor and patted his flank. His glossy paint was chipped and peeling, and his face had given over to rust. His eyes were lively, gazing out of the decay. "You need a new coat of paint, Stanley," Charlie said. The unicorn stared ahead, unresponsive. At the foot of the bed, there was a wheel. Made of patched-together metal, it had always reminded her of something she might find on a submarine. Charlie turned it. It stuck for a moment, then gave away, rotating as it always did, and across the room, the smallest closet door swung open. Out sailed Ella on her track, a child-sized doll bearing a teacup and saucer in her tiny hands like an offering. Ella's plaid dress was still crisp, and her patent leather shoes still shone. Perhaps the closet had protected her from the damage of the damp. Charlie had an... There's two hads here. Charlie had an identical outfit back when she and Ella were the same height. "Hi, Ella," she said softly. As the wheel unwound, Ella retreated to the closet again, the door closing behind her. Charlie followed her. The closets had been built to align with the slant of the ceiling, and there was 3 of them. Ella lived in the short one, which was about 3.5 feet tall. Next to it was one a foot or so taller, and a third closest to the bedroom door was the same height as the rest of the room. She smiled, remembering. "Why do you have 3 closets?" John had demanded the first time he came over. She looked at him blankly, confused by the question. "'Cause that's how many there are," she said finally. She pointed defensively to the littlest one. "That one's Ella's anyway," she added. John nodded, satisfied. Charlie shook her head and opened the door to the middle closet, or tried to. The knob stopped with a jolt. It was locked. She rattled it a few times, but gave up without much conviction. She stayed crouched low to the floor and glanced up at the tallest closet, her big girl closet that she would someday grow into. "You won't need it until you're bigger," her father would say, but that day never came. The door now hung open slightly, but Charlie didn't disturb it. It hadn't opened for her. It had only given way to time. As she moved to the stand, she noticed something shiny half hidden under the rim of the locked metal door. She leaned forward to pick it up. It looked like a broken-off piece of a circuit board. She smiled slightly. Nuts, bolts, scraps, and parts had turned up all over the place. Once upon a time, her father always had stray parts in his pockets. He would carry around something he was working on, set it down, and forget where it was, or worse, put something aside for safekeeping, never to be seen again. There was also a strand of her hair clinging to it. She unwound it carefully from the tiny lip of metal that it was stuck on. Finally, as though she had been putting it off, Charlie crossed the room and picked up Theodore. His back had not faded in the sun like the front of his body, and it was the same rich dark purple she remembered. She pressed the button at the base of his neck, but he remained lifeless. His fur was threadbare, one ear hanging loose by a single rotting thread, and through the hole she could see the green plastic of his circuit board. Charlie held her breath, listening fearfully for something. Louis? I love you, Charlie, I think. The rabbit said with a barely audible halting noise, and Charlie set him down, her face hot and her chest pitched tight. She had not really expected to hear her father's voice again. "I love you too." Charlie looked around the room. When she was a child, it had been her own magical world, and she was possessive of it. Only a few chosen friends were ever even allowed inside. She went to her bed and set Stanley moving on his track again. She left, closing the door behind her before the little unicorn came to a halt. She went out the back door to the driveway and stopped in front of the garage that had been her father's workshop. Half buried in the gravel a few feet away was a piece of metal, and Charlie went to pick it up. It was jointed in the middle, and she held it in her hand, smiling a little as she bent it back and forward. An elbow joint, she thought. I wonder who that was going to belong to. Hi. Nice to see you in the chat. She had stood in this exact spot many times before. She closed her eyes and the memory overwhelmed her. She was a little girl again, sitting on the floor of her father's workshop, playing with the scraps of wood and metal, as though they were toy blocks, trying to build a tower with the uneven pieces. The shop was hot, and she was she was sweaty. Grime sticking to her legs, and she sat in her shorts and sneakers. She could almost smell the sharp, metallic odor of the smoldering iron. Her father was nearby, never out of sight, working on Stanley the unicorn. Stanley's face was still unfinished, one side white and shining and friendly, with a gleaming brown eye that seemed to almost see. A gleaming brown eye that seemed almost to see. Sorry. The other half of the toy's face was all exposed. Circuit boards and metal parts. Charlie's father looked at her and smiled, and she smiled back. Beloved. In a darkened corner behind her father, barely visible, hung a jumble of metal limbs, a twisted skeleton with burning silver eyes. Silver eyes. See, they said the thing. Every once in a while, it gave an uncanny twitch. Charlie tried never to look at it, but as her father worked and as she played with her makeshift toys, her eye was drawn back to it again and again. The limbs contorted seemed almost mocking the thing, a ghastly gesture, and yet there was something about it that suggested enormous pain. Daddy? Charlie said, and her father did not look up from his work. Daddy? She said again, more urgently, and this time he turned to her slowly, as though not fully present in the world. What do you need, sweetie? She pointed at the metal skeleton. Does it hurt? She wanted to ask the question, but when she looked into her father's eyes, she found she could not. She shook her head. Nothing. He nodded at her with an absent smile and went back to his work. Behind him, the creature gave another awful twitch, and its eyes still burned. Let's see. Okay, Charlie shivered and drew herself back to the present. She glanced behind her, feeling exposed. She looked down, and her gaze fixed on something, 3 widely spaced grooves in the ground. She knelt thoughtful and ran her finger over one of them. The gravel was scattered away, the marks worn heavily into the dirt. A camera tripod of some sort? It was the first unfamiliar thing she'd seen. The door to the workshop was cracked open slightly and inviting, but she felt no desire to go inside. Quickly, she headed back to her car, but she stopped as soon as she settled into the driver's seat. Her keys were gone, having probably fallen out of her pocket somewhere in the house. She retraced her steps, merely glancing into the living room and kitchen before heading up to her bedroom. The keys were on the wicker chair beside Theodore the rabbit. She picked them up and jangled them for a moment, not quite ready to leave the room behind. She sat down on the bed. Stanley the unicorn had stopped beside the bed, as he always did. As she sat, she patted him absently on the head. It had grown dark while she was outside, and the room was now cast in shadows. Somehow, without the bright sunlight, the toy's flaws and deterioration were thrown into sharp relief. Theodore's eyes no longer shone, and his thin fur and hanging ear made him look like a sickly vagabond. When she looked down at Stanley, the rust around his eyes made him look like hollow sockets, and his bare teeth, which had always thought of as a smile, became the awful knowing grin of a skull. Ugh. Charlie stood up, careful not to touch him, and hurried toward the door, but her foot caught on the wheel beside the bed. She tripped on the tracks and fell sprawling to the floor. There was a whir of spinning metal, and as she raised her head, a small pair of feet appeared under her nose, clad in shining patent leather. She looked up. There above her was Ella, staring down at her, silent and uninvited, her glassy eyes almost appearing to see. The teacup and saucer were held out before her with a military stiffness. Charlie got up cautiously, taking care not to disturb the doll. She left the room, stepping carefully to avoid accidentally activating any other toys. As Charlie went, Ella retreated to her closet, almost matching her pace. Charlie hurried down the stairs, seized by an urgency to get away. In the car, she fumbled the key 3 times before sliding it into place. She backed too fast down the driveway, running recklessly over the grass of the front yard, and sped away. After about a mile, Charlie pulled over on the shoulder and turned the car off, staring straight ahead through the windshield, her eyes focused on nothing. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror so she could see herself. She always expected to see pain, anger, and sorrow written on her face, but they never were. Her cheeks were pink, and her round face looked almost cheerful, like always. Her first weeks living with Aunt Jen, she heard the same things over and over when Aunt Jen introduced her. What a pretty child! What a happy-looking child she is! Charlie always looked like she was about to smile. Her brown eyes, wide and sparkling, her thin mouth ready to curve up, even when she wanted to sob. The incongruity was a mild betrayal. She ran her fingers through her light brown hair though that would magically fix its slight frizziness and put the mirror back in position. Yeah, it does look pretty good. It's a great book. Although I never read it yet. This is my first time reading it. She turned the car back on and searched for a radio station, hoping music might bring her fully back to reality. She flipped from station to station, not really hearing what any of them were playing, and finally settled on an AM broadcast with a host who seemed to be yelling condescendingly at his audience. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the brash and annoying sound was enough to jar her back into the present. The clock in the car was always wrong, so she checked her watch. It was almost time to meet her friends at the diner they had chosen, near the center of town. Charlie pulled back onto the road and drove, letting the sound of the angry talk radio host soothe her mind. When she reached the restaurant, Charlie pulled into the lot and stopped, but did not park. In front of the diner had a long picture window all across it, and she could see right inside. Though she had not seen them for years, it took her only a moment to spot her friends through the glass. Jessica was easiest to pick out from the crowd. She always enclosed pictures with her letters, and right now she looked exactly like her last photo. Even seated, she was clearly taller than either of the boys and very thin. Though Charlie could not see her whole outfit, she was wearing a loose white shirt with an embroidered vest, and she had a brimmed hat perched on her glossy shoulder-length brown hair with an enormous flower threatening to tip it off her head. She was gesturing excitedly about something as she spoke. The two boys were sitting next to each other, facing her. Carlton looked like an older version of his red-headed childhood self. He still had a bit of a baby face, but his features had refined, and his hair was carefully tousled and held in place by some alchemical hair product. He was almost pretty for a boy, and he wore a black workout shirt, though she doubted he'd ever worked out a day in his life. He slouched forward on the table, resting his chin in his hands. Beside him, John sat closest to the window. John had been the kind of child who got dirty before he went outside. There would be paint on his shirt before the teacher handed out the watercolors, grass stains on his knees before they came near a playground, and dirt under his fingernails just after he washed his hands. Charlie knew it was him because it had to be. But he looked completely different. The grubbiness of childhood had been replaced by something crisp and clean. He was wearing a neatly pressed light green button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up and the collar open, preventing him from looking too uptight. He was leaning back confidently in the booth, nodding enthusiastically, apparently absorbed in whatever Jessica was saying. The only concession to his former self was his hair, sticking up all over his head. And he had a 5 o'clock shadow, a smug, adult version of the dirt he was always covered in as a kid. Charlie smiled to herself. John had been something like her childhood crush, before either of them really understood what that meant. He gave her cookies from his Transformers lunchbox, and once in kindergarten he took the blame when she broke the glass jar that held colored beads for arts and crafts. She remembered the moment when it slipped from her hands and she watched it fall. She could not have moved fast enough to catch it, but she would not have tried. She wanted to see it break. The glass hit the wood floor and scattered into 1,000 pieces, and the beads scattered many-colored among the shards. She thought it was beautiful, and then she started to cry. John had a note sent home to his parents, and when she told him thank you, he had winked at her with an irony beyond his years and simply said, "For what?" After that, John was allowed to come to her room. She let him play with Stanley and Theodore, watching anxiously the first time he learned to press the buttons and make them move. She would be crushed if he didn't like them, knowing instinctively that it would make her think less of him. They were her family, but John was fascinated as soon as he saw them. He loved her mechanical toys, and so she loved him. 2 years later, behind a tree beside her father's workshop, she almost let him kiss her. And then it happened, and everything ended, at least for Charlie. My throat's getting dry. Charlie shook herself, forcing her mind back to the present. Looking again at Jessica's polished appearance, she glanced down at herself. Purple t-shirt, denim jacket, black jeans, and combat boots. It had felt like a good choice this morning, but now she wished she had chosen something else. "This is all you ever wear," she reminded herself. She parked and locked the car behind her, even though people in Hurricane did not usually lock their cars. Then she went into the diner to meet her friends for the first time in 10 years. The warmth, noise, and light of the restaurant hit her in a wave as she entered. For a moment, she was overwhelmed, but Jessica saw her pause in the doorway and shouted her name. Charlie smiled and went over. "Hi," she said awkwardly, flicking her eyes at each of them, but not fully making contact. Jessica scooted over on the red vinyl bench and patted the seat beside her. "Here, sit," she said. "I was just telling John and Carlton about my glamorous life." She rolled her eyes as she said it, managing to convey both self-depreciation and the sense that her life was truly something exciting. "Did you know Jessica lives in New York?" Carlton said. There was something careful about the way he spoke, like he was thinking about his words before he formed them. John was silent, but he smiled at Charlie anxiously. Jessica rolled her eyes again, and with a flash of déjà vu, Charlie suddenly recalled that this had been a habit even when they were children. 8 million people live in New York, called Carlton. "It's not exactly an achievement," Jessica said. Carlton shrugged. "I've never been anywhere," he said. "I didn't know you still lived in town," Charlie said. Where else am I going to live? My family has been here since 1896, he added, deepening his voice to mimic his father. "Is that even true?" Charlie asked. "I don't know," Carlton said in his own register. "Could be. Dad ran for mayor 2 years ago. I mean, he lost, but still, who runs for mayor?" He made a face. "I swear the day I turn 18, I am out of here." Where are you going to go?" John asked, looking seriously at Carlton. Carlton met his eyes just as serious for a moment. Abruptly, he broke away and pointed out the window, closing one eye as if to get his aim true. John raised an eyebrow as he looked out the window, trying to follow the line Carlton was pointing to. Charlie looked too. Carlton wasn't pointing at anything. John opened his mouth to say something, but Carlton interrupted. "Or," he said as he smoothly pointed in the opposite direction. "Okay." John scratched his head, looking slightly embarrassed. "Anywhere, right?" he added with a laugh. "Where's everyone else?" Charlie asked. peering out the window and searching the parking lot for new arrivals. Tomorrow, John said. They're coming tomorrow morning, Jessica jumped in to clarify. Marla's bringing her little brother. Can you believe it? Jason? Charlie smiled. She remembered Jason as a little bundle of blankets with a tiny red face peeking out. I mean, who wants a baby around? Jessica adjusted her hat primly. I'm pretty sure he's not a baby anymore, Charlie said, stifling a laugh. Practically a baby, Jessica said. Anyway, I booked us a room at the motel down by the highway. It was all I could find. The boys are staying with Carlton. Okay, Charlie said. She was vaguely impressed by Jessica's organization, but she wasn't happy about the plan. She was loath to share a room with Jessica, who now seemed like a stranger. Jessica had become the kind of girl who intimidated her. Polished and immaculate, speaking as though she had everything in life figured out. For a moment, Charlie considered going back to her old house for the night. But as soon as she thought it, the idea repelled her. That house that night was no longer the province of the living. Don't be dramatic, she scolded herself. But now John was speaking. He had a way of commanding attention with his voice, probably because he spoke less often than everyone else. He spent most of his time listening, but not out of reticence, let's just say that. He was gathering information, speaking only when he had wisdom or sarcasm to dispense. Often it was both at once. Does anyone know what's happening tomorrow? They were all silent for a moment, and the waitress took the opportunity to come over for their order. Charlie flipped quickly through the menu, her eyes not really focusing on the words. Her turn to order came much faster than she was expecting, and she froze. Eggs, she said at last. The woman's hard expression was still fixed on her, and she realized she had not finished. Scrambled wheat toast, she added, and the woman went away. Charlie looked back down at the menu. She hated this about herself. When she was caught off guard, she seemed to lose all ability to act or process what was going on around her. People were incomprehensible, their demands alien. Ordering dinner shouldn't be hard, she thought. The others had begun their conversation again, and she turned her attention to them, feeling like she had fallen behind. What do we even say to his parents? Jessica was saying. Carlton, do you ever see them? Charlie asked. Not really, he said. Around, I guess, sometimes. I'm surprised they stayed in Hurricane, Jessica said with a note of worldly disapproval in her voice. Charlie said nothing. But she thought, how could they not? His body had never been found. How could they not have secretly hoped he might come home, no matter how impossible they knew it was? How could they leave the only home Michael knew? It would mean really finally giving up on him. Maybe that was what the scholarship was, an admission that he was never coming home. Charlie was acutely aware that they were in a public place, where talking about Michael felt inappropriate. They were, in a sense, both insiders and outsiders. They had been closer to Michael, probably more than anyone in this restaurant, but, with the exception of Carlton, they were no longer from Hurricane. They did not belong. She saw the tears falling on her paper placemat before she felt them, and she hurriedly wiped her eyes, looking down and hoping no one had noticed. When she looked up, John appeared to be studying his silverware, but she knew he had seen. She was grateful to him for not trying to offer comfort. John, do you still write? Charlie asked. John had declared himself an author when they were about 6, having learned to read and write when he was 4, a year ahead of the rest of them. At the age of 7, he completed his first novel and pressed his poorly spelled, inscrutably illustrated creation on his friends and family, demanding reviews. Charlie remembered that he had given him only 2 stars. John laughed at the question. I actually do my E's the right way these days, he said. I can't believe you remember that. But I do actually, yeah, he stopped clearly wanting to say more. What do you write? Carlton obliged. And John looked down at his placemat, speaking mostly to the table. Short stories mostly. I actually had one published last year. I mean, it was just in a magazine, nothing big. They all made suitable noises of being impressed, and he looked up again, embarrassed but pleased. What was the story about, shall I ask? John hesitated, but before he could speak or decide not to, the waitress returned with their food. They had all ordered from the breakfast menu: coffee, eggs, and bacon. Blueberry pancakes for Carlton. The brightly colored food looked hopeful, like a fresh start to the day. Charlie took a bite of her toast, and they all ate silently for a moment. Hey, Carlton, John said suddenly. Whatever happened to Freddy's anyway? There was a brief hush. Carlton looked nervously at Charlie, and Jessica stared up at the ceiling. John flustered red, and Charlie spoke hastily. It's okay, Carlton. It's okay, Carlton. I'd like to know, too. Hold on, let me trade. Carlton shrugged, stabbing at his pancakes nervously with his fork. They built over it, he said. What did they build? Jessica asked. Is there something else there now? Was it built over or just torn down? John asked. Carlton shrugged again, quick like a nervous tick. Like I said, I don't know. It's too far back from the road to see, and I haven't exactly investigated. It might have been leased to someone, but I don't know what they did. It's all been blocked off for years under construction. You can't even tell if the building is still there. So it could still be there, Jessica asked with a spark of excitement breaking through. Like I said, I don't know, Carlton answered. Charlie felt the diner's fluorescent lights glaring down on her face, suddenly too bright. She felt exposed. She had barely eaten, but she found herself rising from the booth, pulling a few crumpled bills from her pocket and dropping them on the table. I'm going to go outside for a minute, she said. Smoke break, she added hastily. You don't smoke, she chided herself for the clumsy lie as she made her way to the door, jostling past a family of 4 without saying excuse me, and stepped out into the cool evening. She walked to her car and sat on the hood, the mental denting slightly under her weight. She took in breaths of the cool air as if they were water and closed her eyes. You knew it would come up. You knew you would have to talk about it. She reminded herself. She had practiced on the drive here, had forced herself to think back to happy memories, to smile and say, remember when? She thought she was prepared for this, but of course she had been wrong. Why else would she have run out of the restaurant like a child? Charlie? She opened her eyes and saw John standing next to the car, holding her jacket out in front of him like an offering. You forgot your jacket, he said, and she made herself smile at him. Thanks, she said. She took it and draped it over her shoulders, then slid over on the car's hood for him to sit. Sorry about that, she said. In the dim lights of the parking lot, she could still see him blush to the ears. He joined her on the car's hood, leaving a deliberate space between them. I haven't learned to think before I talk. I'm sorry. John watched the sky as a plane passed overhead. Charlie smiled, this time unforced. It's okay. I knew it was going to come up. It had to. It sounds stupid, but I never think about it. I don't let myself. No one knows what happened except my aunt, and we never talk about it. Then I come here, and suddenly it's everywhere. I was just surprised, that's all. Uh-oh, John pointed, and Charlie saw Jessica and Carlton hesitating in the doorway of the diner. She waved them over, and they came. Remember that time at Freddy's when the merry-go-round got stuck, and Marla and that mean kid Billy had to keep riding it until their parents plucked them off? Charlie said. John laughed, and the sound made her smile. Their faces were bright red, crying like babies. She covered her face, guilty that it was so funny to her. There was a brief surprised silence, then Carlton started laughing. Then Marla puked all over him. Sweet justice, Charlie said. Actually, I think it was nachos, John added. Jessica wrinkled her nose. So gross. I never wrote it again, not after that. Oh, come on, Jessica. They cleaned it, said Carlton. I'm pretty sure kids puked all over that place. Those wet floor signs weren't there for nothing, right, Charlie? Don't look at me, she said. I never puked. We used to spend so much time there. Privileges of knowing the owner's daughter, Jessica said, looking at Charlie with a mock accusation. I couldn't help who my dad was, Charlie said, laughing. Jessica looked thoughtful for a moment before she continued. How could you have a better childhood than spending all day at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza? I don't know, said Carlton. I think that music got to me over the years. He hummed a few bars of the familiar song. Charlie dipped her head to it, recalling the tune. I love those animals so much, Jessica said suddenly. What's the proper term for them? Animals? Robots? Mascots? I think those are all accurate, Charlie leaned back. Well, anyway, I used to go and talk to the bunny. What was his name? Bonnie, Charlie said. Yeah, said Jessica. I used to complain to him about my parents. I always thought he had an understanding look about him. Carlton laughed. Animatronic therapy, recommended by 6 out of 7 crazy people. Shut up, Jessica retorted. I knew he wasn't real. I just liked talking to him. Charlie smiled a little, and I remember that... Charlie smiled a little. I remember that, she said. Jessica in her prim little dresses, her brown hair in 2 tight braids, like a little kid out of an old book. Walking up to the stage when the show was over, whispering earnestly to the life-size animatronic rabbit. If anyone came up beside her, she went instantly silent and still, waiting for them to go away so she could resume her one-sided conversations. Charlie had never talked to the animals at her father's restaurant or felt close to them like those kids seemed to. Although she liked them, they belonged to the public. She had her own toys, mechanical friends waiting for her at home. They belonged only to her. I liked Freddy, said John. He always seemed the most relatable. You know, there are a lot of things about my childhood that I can't remember at all, Carlton said. But I swear, I can close my eyes and see every last detail of that place. Even the gum I used to stick under the tables. Gum? Yeah, right. Those were boogers. Jessica took a tiny step away from Carlton. He grinned. I was 7. What do you want? You all picked on me back then. Remember when Marla wrote Carlton smells like feet on the wall outside? You did smell like feet, Jessica laughed with a sudden outburst. Carlton shrugged, unperturbed. I used to try to hide when it was time to go home. I wanted to be stuck in there overnight so I could have the whole place to myself. Yeah, you always kept everyone waiting, said John, and you always hid under the same table. Charlie spoke slowly, and when she did, everyone turned to her as though they had been waiting. Sometimes I feel like I remember every inch of it, like Carlton, she said, but sometimes it's like I hardly remember it at all. It's all in pieces. Like I remember the carousel, and that time it got stuck. I remember drawing on the placemats. I remember little things, eating that greasy pizza, hugging Freddy in the summer, and his yellow fur getting stuck all over my clothes. But a lot of it is like pictures, like it happened to someone else. They were all looking at her oddly. Freddy was brown, right? Jessica looked to the others for confirmation. I guess you really don't remember it that well after all, Carlton teased Charlie, and she laughed briefly. Right, I meant brown, she said. Brown. Freddy was brown. Of course he was. She could see him in her mind now, but somewhere in the depths of her recall there was a flash of something else. Carlton launched into another story, and Charlie tried to turn her attention to him. But there was something disturbing, worrisome about that lapse in memory. It was 10 years ago. It's not like you've got dementia at 17, she told herself. But it was such a basic detail to have misremembered. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught John looking at her, a pensive expression on his face, as though she had something important. You really don't know what happened to it? She asked Carlton, with more urgency in her voice than she intended. He'd stopped talking, surprised. Sorry, she said. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's okay, he said. But yeah, or no. I really don't know what happened. How can you not know? You live here. Charlie, come on, said John. It's not like I hang around that part of town. Things are different. The town has grown, Carlton said mildly, seeming unruffled by her outburst. And I honestly don't look for reasons to go around there, you know. Why would I? There isn't any reason, not anymore. We could go there, John said suddenly, and Charlie's heart skipped. Carlton looked nervously at Charlie. What? Seriously, it's a mess. What? Seriously, it's a mess. I don't know if you can even get to it. Charlie found herself nodding. She felt as though she had spent the whole day weighed down by memory, seeing everything through a filter of years. And now she felt suddenly alert, her mind fully present. She wanted to go. Let's do it, she said. Even if there's nothing there, I want to see. They were all silent. Suddenly John smiled with a reckless confidence. Yeah, let's do it. Oh boy. It took me less than an hour to read the first chapter, which was 30 pages? What the hell? Seriously. I spent 51 and a half minutes reading the first chapter, which was 30 pages long. Let me see. Where does chapter 4 start? Yeah, I'm definitely ending the stream after chapter 3. Okay. So, well, looks like they've gotten themselves into a pickle. Chapter 2. Charlie pulled to a stop, feeling the soft give of dirt under her tires and turn off the car. She got out and surveyed their surroundings. The sky was rich dark blue, the last trails of the sunset streaking off to the west. The parking lot was unpaved, and before them lay a sprawling monster of a building, a rising acre of glass and concrete. There were lamps in the parking lot that had never been used, and no lights shone out onto the lot. The building itself looked like an abandoned sanctuary, entombed in black trees amidst the distant roar of civilization. She looked at Jessica in the passenger seat, who was craning her neck out the window. Is this the right place? Jessica asked. Ugh, what have I gotten myself into? Ugh. Okay. Charlie shook her head slowly, not quite certain what she was seeing. I don't know, she whispered. Charlie got out of the car and stood in silence as John and Carlton pulled up beside her. Let me see. Okay. What is this? John stepped out of the car cautiously and stared blankly at the monument. Does anyone have a flashlight? He looked at each of them. Carlton held up his keychain and waved around the feeble glow of a pen light for a minute. Great! Great, John muttered, walking away with resignation. Hold on a sec, Charlie said, and went around to her trunk. My aunt makes me carry around a bunch of stuff for emergencies. Aunt Jen, loving but severe, had taught Charlie self-reliance above almost anything else. Before she let Charlie have her old blue Honda, she had insisted that Charlie know how to change a tire, check the oil, and know the basic parts of the engine. In the trunk, in a black box tucked in next to the jack, spare tire, and small crowbar, she had a blanket, a heavy police-issue flashlight, bottled water, granola bars, matches, and emergency flares. Charlie grabbed the flashlight. Carlton grabbed a granola bar. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Almost by silent agreement, they began to walk the building's perimeter, Charlie holding up the light in a steady beam in front of them. The building itself looked mostly finished, but the ground was all dirt and rock, uneven and soft. Charlie shone the light on the ground where grass had grown patchy in the dirt, inches long. No one has been digging for a while, Charlie said. The place was massive, and it took a long time to circumnavigate. It wasn't long before the rich blue of the evening was overtaken by a blanket of shattered silver clouds and stars. The surfaces of the building were all the same smooth, beige concrete with windows too high up on the walls to see inside. Did they really build this whole thing and just leave? Jessica said. Carlton, said John, you really don't know anything about what happened? Carlton shrugged expansively. I told you, I knew there was construction, but I don't know anything else. Why would they do this? John seemed almost paranoid, shouting at the trees as though eyes might be looking back at him. It just goes on, he squinted, gazing along the outside wall of the building, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. He glanced back to the trees as if making sure that they hadn't missed a building somehow. No, it was here. He placed his hand on the drab concrete facing. It's gone. After a moment, he gestured to the others and began to walk back the way they came. Reluctantly, Charlie turned back, following the group. They kept going until they could see their cars again, up ahead in the darkness. Sorry, guys. I hope there would be at least something familiar, Carlton said exhaustedly. Yeah, Charlie said she had known it would be, but seeing that Freddy's has been razed to the ground was still a shock. It was so paramount sometimes in her mind that she wanted to get rid of it, wanted to scrub the memories, good and bad, from her head as if they had never been. Now someone had scrubbed it from the landscape and felt like a violation. And it felt like a violation. It should have been up to her. Right, she thought, because you had the money to buy it and preserve it like Aunt Jen did with the house. Charlie? John was saying her name, and it sounded like he was repeating it. Sorry, she said. What were you saying? Do you want to go inside? Jessica asked. Charlie was surprised they were only now considering this, but then again, none of them was really prone to criminal activity. The thought was a release, and she took a deep breath, speaking on her exhale. Why not? She asked, almost laughing. She hefted the flashlight. Her arms were getting tired. Anyone else want to turn? She waved it back and forth like a pendulum. Carlton grabbed it and took a moment to appreciate its weight. Why is this so heavy? He said, passing it off to John. Here you go. It's a police flashlight, Charlie said absently. You can hit people with it. Jessica wrinkled her nose. Your aunt really wasn't kidding around, huh? Ever used it? Not yet. Charlie winked and made a half-threatening glance at John, who returned an uncertain half-smile, unsure how to react. The wide entrances were sealed with hammered metal doors, no doubt intended to be temporary until construction was finished. Still, it wasn't difficult to find a way in, since many large mounds of gravel and sand scaled the walls, leading right up to the edges of the large, gaping windows. Not trying hard to keep people out, John said. What's anyone going to steal? Charlie said, staring at the blank, towering walls. They climbed the hill slowly, the gravel shifting and sliding beneath their feet as they went. Carlton reached the window first and peered through. Jessica looked over his shoulder. Can we drop down? John asked. Yes, said Carlton. No, Jessica said at precisely the same time. I'll go, Charlie said. She felt reckless. Without looking through to see how far the fall was, she put her feet through the opening and let herself drop. She landed, knees bent. The impact rocked her, but it did not hurt. She looked up at her friend staring down. Oh, hang on, Charlie called, pulling a short stepladder from a wall nearby and setting it under the window. Okay, she said, come on. Guess they're really doing this. They dropped down one by one and looked around them. Inside was an atrium, or maybe it would have become a food court with metal benches, and plastic tables scattered around. Some bolted to the floor. The ceiling rose up high above them, with a glass roof where they could see the stars peering down at them. Very post-apocalyptic, Charlie joked, her voice echoing in the open space. Jessica sang a brief, wordless scale suddenly, startling them all into silence. Her voice rang out pure and clear, something beautiful in the emptiness. Very, very nice, but let's not call too much attention to ourselves, John said. Right, Jessica said, still very happy with herself, as they walked on. Carlton swept up and took her arm. Your voice is amazing, he said. It's just good acoustics, Jessica said, attempting humility, but not meaning a word of it. They walked the empty halls, peering into each of the massive cavities where a department store might have been. Some parts of the mall had almost been finished, while others were in shambles. Some hallways were littered with piles of dusty concrete bricks and stacks of wood. Others were lined with glass-paneled storefronts, lights hanging in perfect rows above their heads. It's like a lost city, John said. Like Pompeii, said Jessica, just without the volcano. No, Charlie said. There's nothing here. The whole place had a sterile feel to it. It was not abandoned. It had never sustained life at all. She looked in a store window across from her, one of the few with glass wondering that would have been displayed. She imagined mannequins, dressed in bright clothing, but when she tried to picture them, all she could see was blank faces concealing something. She suddenly felt out of place, unwelcomed by the building itself. Charlie began to feel restless, some of the luster wearing off the adventure. They had come. Freddy's was gone, and so was the shrine she had kept in her thoughts, where she could still find Michael playing where she last saw him. John stopped suddenly, turning off the flashlight as carefully as he could. He put a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. He gestured back the way they had come. In the distance, they saw a small light bobbing in the darkness like a ship in the fog. Someone else is here, he hissed. A night guard, maybe? Carlton whispered. Why would an abandoned building need a guard? Charlie wondered. Kids probably come here to party, Carlton said, then grinned. I would have come here to party too if I'd have known about it or if I partied. Okay, well, let's backtrack slowly, John said. Jessica, he started, then made a zip-it motion across his lips. They continued down the hallway this time with only the dimmer light of Carlton's keychain. Wait! Jessica stopped with a whisper, looking intensely at the wall surrounding them. Something's not right. Yeah, no giant pretzels, I know. Carlton seemed sincere. Jessica waved a hand at him impatiently. No, something isn't right about the architecture. She took several steps back, trying to see the whole of it. Something is definitely not right, she repeated. It's bigger on the outside. Bigger on the outside? Charlie repeated, sounding puzzled. I mean, there's a big difference between where the inside wall is and where the outside wall is. Look. Jessica ran along a length of wall between where two stores would have been. There would have been a store here and a store there. John pointed to the obvious, not understanding the problem. But there's something in the middle, Jessica exclaimed, beating her hand against an empty portion of the wall. This part juts out into the parking lot like the stores on each side, but there's no way into it. You're right, Charlie started walking toward Jessica, studying the walls. There should be another entrance here. And Jessica dropped her voice so that only Charlie could hear her. About the same size as Freddy's. Don't you think? Charlie's eyes widened and she took a quick step from Jessica. What are you two whispering about? Carlton stepped closer. We're talking about you, Jessica said sharply, and they walked into one of the vacant department stores that seemed to sandwich the sealed space. Come on, she said. Let's take a look. They started combining the wall as a group, clustered around the tiny light. Charlie was not sure what to hope for. Aunt Jen had warned her about coming back. She didn't encourage Charlie to skip the memorial, not directly, but she wasn't pleased that Charlie was returning to Hurricane. Just be careful, Aunt Jen, she had said. Some things, some memories, are best left undisturbed. Is that why you kept Dad's house? Charlie thought now. Is that why you kept paying for it, leaving it untouched like some kind of shrine, but never visiting? Hey! John was gesturing wildly, running inside to catch up to the rest of them. Hide! The light was coming out of the hall again, bobbing up and down, and it was coming closer. Charlie glanced around. They were already too deep inside the massive store to get out in time, and there seemed to be nowhere to hide. Here, here, Jessica whispered. There was a break in the wall beside a rig of scaffolding, and they hurried into it, squeezing past stacks of open boxes and sheets of plastic hanging from the ceiling. They made their way down what appeared to be a makeshift hallway just on the other side of the department store wall. It was really more like an alley. It was incongruous with the rest of the mall, not shiny and new, but dank and musty. One wall was made of the same concrete as the outside of the building, though it was rough and unfinished, and the other was exposed brick, some parts faded smooth with age, others with the mortar crumbling, leaving chinks and holes. Heavy wooden shelves of cleaning equipment stood against the wall, listing to the side, their boards sinking under the weight of old paint cans and mysterious buckets. Something was dripping from uncovered pipes overhead, leaving puddles that they all stepped carefully around. A mouse scuttled by, almost running over Carlton's foot. Carlton made a strangled sound, hand over his mouth. They crouched down behind one of the wooden shelving units, pressing up against the wall. Charlie doused the light and waited. She took shallow breaths, perfectly still, and watching and wishing she had picked a better position to freeze into. After a few minutes, her legs started to feel numb under her, and Carlton was so close that she could smell the light, pleasant scent of his shampoo. That's nice, she whispered. Thanks, Carlton, knowing immediately what she was referring to. It comes in Ocean Breeze and Tropical Paradise. I prefer Ocean Breeze, but it dries the scalp. Hush, John hissed. Charlie wasn't sure why she was so worried. It was just a night guard. At the worst, they would be asked to leave, maybe yelled at a little. She had an overblown aversion to getting in trouble. The bobbing light came closer. Charlie was acutely aware of her body, holding every muscle motionless. Suddenly she could make out a thin figure leaning in from the great room outside. He shone his light in a long beam down the hallway, sweeping it up and down the halls. He's got us, Charlie thought, but inexplicably he turned and went, apparently satisfied. They waited for another few minutes, but there was nothing. He was gone. They all moved slowly out of their crouched position, stretching limbs that had gone to sleep. Carlton shook one foot vigorously until he could stand on it. Charlie looked down at Jessica, who was still hunched over as if frozen in time. Jessica, are you okay? She whispered. Jessica looked up, smiling. You won't believe this. She was pointing at the wall, and Charlie leaned over to see. There, etched in the worn brick, were clumsy letters, almost illegible in a child's handiwork. Carlton smells like feet. You have to be... Carlton smells like feet. You have to be kidding me, John whispered in awe, turning to face the wall and placing both hands against it. I recognize these bricks, he laughed. These are the same bricks, his smile faded. They didn't tear it down. They built around it. It's still here. Jessica unsuccessfully tried to keep her voice down. There has to be a way in, she added, her eyes wide with an almost childish excitement. Charlie shone the flashlight up and down the hallway, playing the light off each wall, but there was no break, no door. There was a back door to Freddy's, John said. Marla wrote that right next to the back door, right? Why didn't they just knock it down? Charlie pondered. Does this hallway just lead nowhere? Jessica said, puzzled. It's the story of my life, Carlton said lightly. Wait. Charlie ran her fingers along the edge of a shelf, peering through the odds and ends crammed into it. The wall behind it looked different. It was metal, not brick. Right here, she stepped back and looked at the others. Help me move it. John and Jessica pressed against one side in a unified effort, and she and Carlton pulled on the other. It was immensely heavy and laden with cleaning supplies and large buckets of nails and tools, but it slid further down the hall almost easily, without incident. Jessica stepped back, breathing hard. John, give me that big light again. He handed it over, and she turned it back on, aiming where the shelf had stood. This is it, she said. It was metal and rusting, spattered with paint, a stark contrast to the walls around it. There was only a hole where the handle had been. Someone must have removed it so the shelf could lie flush against the door. Silently, Charlie handed the flashlight back to John, and he held it above her head so she could see. She slipped around the others and tried to squeeze her fingers into the hole where the doorknob once was, trying to pull it open to no avail. It's not going to open, she said. John was behind her, peering over her shoulder. Just a second. He squeezed himself into the space beside her and knelt carefully. I don't think it's locked or anything, he said. I think it's just rusty. Look at it. Ooh. Helpy's hour. I'm just as nervous as you are. Let's see. Okay. Okay. The door extended all the way to the floor, its bottom ragged and unfinished. The hinges were on the other side, and the edges were caked in rust. It looked as though it had not been opened in years. Hi, Helpy. John and Charlie pulled on it. Of course I did. I was looking at chat. Okay. John and Charlie pulled on it together, and it moved a fraction of an inch. Yay! Jessica exclaimed, almost shouting, and then covered her mouth. Sorry, she said in a whisper, containing my excitement. They took turns pulling on it, leaning over one another, the metal scraping their fingers. The door held for a long moment, and then it came loose under their weight, swinging open slowly with an unearthly screech. Charlie looked nervously over her shoulder, but the guard did not appear. The door opened only about a foot wide, and they went one by one until all four were through. Inside, the air changed, and they all stopped short. Ahead of them was a dark hallway familiar to them all. Is this? Jessica whispered, not taking her eyes from the dark expanse. It's here, Charlie thought. She held out her hand for the flashlight, and John handed it to her wordlessly. She shone the light ahead of them, sweeping the walls. They were covered in children's drawings, crayon on yellowing, curling paper. She started forward, on the others followed, feet shuffling on old tile. It seemed to take forever to traverse the hall, or perhaps it was just that they were moving slowly and with methodical, deliberate steps. Eventually, the hallway opened up into a larger expanse, the dining room. It was just as they remembered it, completely preserved. The flashlight beam bounced off 1,000 little things reflective, glittered, or topped with foil ribbon. The tables were still in place, covered in their silver and white checkered cloths. The chairs were pulled up to them haphazardly, some tables with too many and the others with too few. It looked as though the room had been abandoned in the middle of the lunch hour. Everyone had gotten up, expecting to return, but never did. They walked in cautiously, breathing cold, stale air that had been trapped inside for a decade. The whole restaurant gave off a sense of abandonment. No one was coming back. There was a small merry-go-round barely visible in the distant corner, with 4 child-sized ponies still at rest from their last song. In an instant, Charlie froze in place, as did the others. There they were! Eyes stared back from the dark large and lifeless, and illogical panic pulsed through her. Time had held still. No one spoke. No one breathed, as though a predatory animal was stalking them. But as the moments passed, the fear waned until she was back again as a child with old friends, separated from one another for far too long. Charlie walked towards the eyes in a straight line. Behind her, the others were motionless. Hers were the only footsteps. As Charlie walked, she touched the cold back of an old party chair without looking at it, guiding it out of her path. She took one final step, and the eyes in the dark became clear. It was them. Charlie smiled. "Hi," she whispered, too soft for the others to hear. Before her stood 3 animatronic animals, a bear, a rabbit, and a chicken. You know who they are. All standing as tall as adults, maybe taller. That's Freddy, Chica, and Bonnie, alright. Let's see. Their bodies were segmented like artist models, each limb made of distinct squarish pieces, separate at the joints. They belonged to the restaurant, or maybe the restaurant belonged to them. And there had been a time when everyone knew them by name. There was Bonnie the rabbit. His fur was a bright blue. His squared-off muzzle held a permanent smile, and his wide and chipped pink eyes were thick-lidded, giving him a perpetually worn-out expression. His ears stuck up straight, crinkling over the top, and his large feet splayed out for balance. He held a red bass guitar, blue paws poised to play, and around his neck was a bow tie that matches the instrument's fiery color. Chica the chicken was more bulky and had an apprehensive look. Thick black eyebrows arching over her purple eyes and her beak slightly open, revealing teeth. As she held out a cupcake on a platter, the cupcake itself was somewhat disturbing, with eyes set into its pink frosting and teeth hanging out over the cake, a single candle sticking out the top. I always expected the cupcake to jump off the plate. Carlton gave a half laugh and cautiously stepped up to Charlie's side. "They seem taller than I remember," he added in a whisper. "That's because you never got this close as a kid." Charlie smiled at ease and stepped closer. "Yes, I'm reading FNaF. This is my first time reading it." Okay. "You were busy hiding under the tables," Jessica said from behind them, still some distance away. Chica wore a bib around her neck with the words, "Let's eat," set out in purple and yellow against a confetti-covered background. A tuft of feathers stuck up in the middle of her head. Standing between Bonnie and Chica was Freddy Fazbear himself, the namesake of the restaurant. He was the most genial looking of the 3, seeming at ease where he was. A robust, if lean, brown bear, he smiled down at the audience, holding a microphone in one paw, sporting a black bow tie and top hat. Okay, I'm on chapter 2, and nice to meet you two. Helpy, talking for flowers. Thank you for coming. Okay, let me see. The only incongruity in his features was the color of his eyes, a bright blue that surely no bear had ever had before him. His mouth hung open and his eyes were partially closed as though he had been frozen in song. Carlton drew closer to the stage until his knees pressed against the rim of it. "Hey, Freddy," he whispered. "Long time no see." He reached out and grabbed at the microphone, wiggling it to see if he could get it loose. "Don't!" Charlie blurted, looking up into Freddy's fixed gaze as though making sure he hadn't noticed. Yeah, I just found these books at Goodwill, actually. I found this book at Goodwill, so I'm reading it for October. Carlton pulled his hand back like he had touched something hot. "Sorry." Come on, John said, cracking a smile. Come on, John said, cracking a smile. Don't you want to see the rest of the place? They spread out across the room, peering them into corners and carefully trying doors, acting as though everything might be breakable to the touch. John went over to the small carousel, and Carlton disappeared into the dark arcade off the main room. I remember it being a lot brighter and noisier in here. Carlton smiled as though at home again, running his hands over the aging knobs and flat plastic buttons. I wonder if my high scores are still in there, he muttered to himself. To the left of the stage was a small hallway, half hoping no one would ever notice where she had gone. Charlie started it down silently as the others occupied themselves with their own curiosities. At the end of the short, plain corridor was her father's office. It had been Charlie's favorite place in the restaurant. She liked to play with her friends in the main area, but she loved the singular privilege of coming back here with her father when her father was doing paperwork. She paused outside the closed door, her hand poised over the knob, remembering. Most of the room was filled with his desk, his filing cabinets, and small boxes of uninteresting parts. In one corner was a smaller filing cabinet painted a salmon color that Charlie had always insisted was pink. That had been Charlie's. The bottom drawer held toys and crayons, and the top had what she liked to call my paperwork. It was mostly coloring books and drawings, but occasionally she would go over to her father's desk and try to copy down whatever he was writing in a childish crayoned hand. Charlie tried the door, but it was locked. Better this way, she thought. The office was personal, and she did not really want it open tonight. Okay. Aw, thanks, guys. She headed back into the main dining room and found John looking pensively at the merry-go-round. He eyed her with curiosity, but did not ask where she had gone. I used to love this thing, Charlie smiled, approaching warmly. Yet now the painted figure seemed odd and lifeless to her. John made a face as though he knew what she was thinking. Not the same, he said. He rubbed his hand over the top of a polished pony as though to scratch it behind the ear. Just not the same, he repeated, removing his hand and gazing elsewhere. Charlie glanced over to see where the others were in the arcade. She could see Jessica and Carlton wandering among the games. The consoles stood still and unlit like massive tombstones, their screens blank. I never liked playing the games, Jessica said, smiling. They moved too fast, and just when I'd start to figure out what to do, I'd die and it would be someone else's turn. She wiggled a joystick that squeaked from neglect. They were rigged anyway, Carlton said with a wink. When's the last time you played one of these? Jessica asked, peering closely into one of the screens to see what image was buried into it from too many years of use. Carlton was busy rocking a pinball machine back and forth, trying to get a ball to come loose. There's a pizza place I visit sometimes. He set the table back on 4 legs and carefully glanced at Jessica. But it's no Freddy's, he added. John was roaming through the dining room again amid the tables. Flicking the stars and spirals hanging overhead, he plucked a red party hat from the table, stretched the rubber band hanging loosely from its base, and snapped it around his head, red and white tassels hanging down from over his face. Oh, let's check out the kitchen, he said. Charlie followed as he bounded off toward it. Although the kitchen had been off limits to her friends, she'd spent a lot of time there, so much so that the chefs chased her out by name, or at least by the name they heard her father call her, Charlotte. John overheard someone calling her Charlotte one day when they were in kindergarten and persisted in teasing her with it constantly. He could always get a rise out of her with that. It wasn't that Charlie didn't like her full name, but Charlie was who she was to the world. Her father called her Charlotte, and it was like a secret between them. Something no one else was allowed to share. The day she left Hurricane for good, the day they said goodbye, John had hesitated. "Bye, Charlie," he said in their cards, letters, and phone calls. He had never called her Charlotte again. She never asked why, and he never told her. The kitchen was still fully stocked with pots and pans, but it held little interest for Charlie in the midst of her memories. She headed back out into the open space of the dining room, and John followed. At the same time, Jessica and Carlton stumbled out of the arcade, tripping into each other as they crossed the thresholds between rooms in the dark. "Anything interesting?" John asked. A gum wrapper, 30 cents, and Jessica, no, not really," Carlton said. Jessica playfully gave him a punch in the shoulder. "Oh, we all forgotten?" Jessica gave an evil smile, pointing to another hallway on the opposite side of the dining room. She headed toward it swiftly before anyone could answer, and they followed her. The hallway was long and narrow, and the farther they went in, the less the flashlight seemed to illuminate. At last, the passage opened out into a small room for private parties set up with its own tables and chairs. As they entered, there was a collective hush. There, in front of them, was a small stage, the curtains drawn. I think I know who we're going to see next. A sign was strung across the front, out of order. It read in neat, handwritten letters. They stood still for a minute, then Jessica went up to it and poked the sign. "Pirate's Cove," she said. 10 years later, and it's still out of order. "Don't touch it," Charlie thought. "I had one birthday back here," John said. "It was out of order then, too." He took hold of the edge of the curtain and rubbed the glittered fabric between his fingers. "No," Charlie wanted to say again, but stopped. "You're being silly," she chided herself. "Yep, it's Foxy, all right. Do you think he's still back there?" Jessica said playfully, threatening to make the reveal with one giant swing on the curtain. "I'm sure he is." John gave a false smile, seeming uncomfortable for the first time. "Yes, he's still there," Charlie thought. He stepped back cautiously, suddenly becoming aware of the drawings and posters surrounding them like spiders on the wall. Charlie's flashlight carefully inched from picture to picture, all depicting different variations of the same character. A large and energetic pirate fox with a patch over one eye and a hook for a hand, usually swinging in to deliver a pizza to hungry children. "This is the room where you were the one hiding under the tables," Jessica said to Charlie, trying to laugh. "But you're a big girl now, right?" Jessica climbed up on the stage unsteadily, almost losing her footing. John reached out a hand to steady her as she righted herself. She giggled nervously, looking down at the others as though for guidance, then grabbed hold of the tasseled edge of the fabric. She waved her other hand in front of her and as dust fell from the cloth. "Maybe this isn't a good idea," she laughed. But there was an edge to her voice, like she really meant it, and she looked down at the stage for a moment as though poised to climb back down. Still, she didn't move, taking the edge of the curtain again. "Wait," John said. "Can you hear that?" They were all dead quiet, and in silence, Charlie could hear them all breathing. John's breaths were deliberate and calm. Jessica's quick and nervous, and as she thought about it, her own breathing began to feel odd, like she had forgotten how to do it. "I don't hear anything," she said. "Me neither," Jessica echoed. "What is it?" "Music. It's coming from..." He gestured back the way they come. "From the stage?" Charlie cocked her hand to the side. "I don't hear it. It's like a music box," he said. Charlie and Jessica listened carefully, but their blank expressions didn't change. "It stopped, I guess." John returned his gaze forward. "Maybe it was an ice cream truck," Jessica whispered. "Hey, that wouldn't be so bad right now." John appreciated the levity. Jessica turned her attention back to the curtain, but John began to hum a tune to himself. "It reminded me of something," he mumbled. Okay, here I go, Jessica announced. She did not move. Charlie found her eyes drawn to Jessica's hand on the curtain. Her pink, manicured nails pale against the dark, glittery fabric. It was almost like the hushed moment in a theater crowd, when the lights went dark, but the curtain had not yet risen. They were all anticipating, but they were not watching a play, no longer playing a game. All the mirth had gone out of Jessica's face. Her cheekbones stood out stark in the shadows, and her eyes looked grim as though the simple thing she was about to do might be of terrible consequence. As Jessica hesitated, Charlie realized her hand hurt. She was making a fist so tight her nails dug into flesh, but she could not force her grip to loosen. Okay? That sounds serious. A crash sounded from back the way they came. A cascading, clanging noise ringing out and filling the whole space. John and Charlie froze, meeting each other's eyes in sudden panic. Jessica dropped the curtain and leaped off the stage, bumping into Charlie and knocking the light out of her hands. "Where's the way out?" she exclaimed, and John came over to help. They hurriedly searched the walls, and Charlie chased the light beams spiraling across the floor. Just as they were all back to their feet, Carlton came trotting in. "I knocked over a bunch of pots in the kitchen," he exclaimed, an apology amid the panic. "I thought you were with us," Charlie said. "I wanted to see if there was any food left," Carlton said, not making it clear if he'd found anything or not. "Seriously?" John laughed. That guard might have heard," Jessica said anxiously. "We have to get out of here." They started for the door, and Jessica started running. The rest took off after her, picking up speed as they reached the hallway until they were racing as though something were behind them. "Run, run," John called out, and they all burst into giggles, the panic feigned but the urgency real. They squeezed back through the door one by one and pushed it shut with the same painful squeal. Carlton and John leaning on it until it sealed. They all took hold of the shelf, leaning on it until it sealed. They all took hold of the shelf, hefting it back into place, and replacing the tools so that it appeared undisturbed. "Look good?" Jessica said, and John tugged her arm, guiding her away. They made their way quickly but carefully back the way they came, using only Carlton's pen light, back through the empty hallways and the open atrium to the parking lot. The guard's light did not appear again. "Little anticlimactic," Carlton said, with disappointed, checking back one more time in hopes they were being chased. "Are you kidding?" Charlie said as she went to her car, already pulling the keys free from her pocket. She felt as though something locked deep inside her hand and had been disturbed, and she was not sure if that was a good thing or not. "That was fun," John exclaimed, and Jessica laughed. "That was terrifying," she cried. "It can be both," Carlton said. Grinning wildly, Charlie began to laugh, and John joined in. "What?" Jessica said. Charlie shook her head, still laughing a little. "It's just we were all exactly the same as we were. I mean, we're totally different and older and everything, but we're the same. You and Carlton sounded exactly like you did when you were 6. "Right," Jessica said, rolling her eyes again, but John nodded. "I know what you mean," he said, "and so does Jessica. She just doesn't like to admit it." She glanced back at them all. "Is everybody sure that the guard didn't see us?" "We can outrun him now," Carlton said reasonably, his hand resting on the car. "I guess," John said, but he did not sound convinced. "You haven't changed either, you know," Jessica said with a certain satisfaction. "Stop looking for problems where there aren't any." "Still," John said, glancing back again, "we should get out of here. I don't want to push our luck." "See you all tomorrow, then?" Jessica said as they parted ways. Carlton gave a little wave over his shoulder. Charlie's heart sank a little as Jessica settled herself into the passenger seat, tidily buckling herself in. She had not been looking forward to this. It wasn't that she didn't like Jessica, just that being alone with her was uncomfortable. She still wasn't much more than a stranger, yet Charlie was still exhilarated from the night's adventure, and the lingering adrenaline gave her a new confidence. She smiled at Jessica. After tonight, they suddenly had something very much in common. "Do you know which way the motel is?" she asked, And Jessica nodded and reached for the purse down at her feet. It was a small and black with a long strap and on the drive to the construction site. Charlie had already seen her remove a lip gloss, a mirror, a pack of breath mints, a sewing kit, and a tiny hairbrush. Now she pulled out a small notebook and pen. Charlie smiled. Sorry, how much stuff do you have in that thing? She asked, and Jessica looked at her with a grin. The secrets of the purse must not be disclosed, she said playfully, and they both laughed. Jessica started reading Charlie the directions. And Charlie obeyed, turning left and right without paying much attention to her surroundings. Jessica had already checked in, so they went straight to their room. A small beige box of a room with 2 double beds covered in shiny brown spreads. Charlie set her bag on the bed closet closest to the door, and Jessica went to the window. As you can see, I splurged on the room with the view, she said, and flung the curtains open dramatically to reveal 2 dumpsters and a dried-out head. I want to have my wedding here. Right, Charlie said, amused. Jessica's prim demeanor and fashioned model looks made it easy to forget that she was smart as well. As a child, she remembered being slightly intimidated every time they got together to play before realizing after the first few minutes how much she liked Jessica. She wondered if it was hard for Jessica to make friends looking the way she did, but it wasn't the kind of thing you could really ask someone. Jessica flopped down on the bed, lying across it to face Charlie. So tell me about you, she said confidently, mocking a talk show host or someone's nosy mother. Charlie shrugged awkwardly, put on the spot. What does that mean, she said. Jessica laughed. I don't know. What an awful thing to ask, right? I mean, how do you answer that? How about school? Any cute boys? Charlie laid down across the bed, mimicking Jessica's position. Cute boys? What are we, 12? Well, Jessica said impatiently. I don't know, she said. Not really. Her class was too small. She had known most of the people in it since she moved in with Aunt Jen, and dating anyone liking them like that seemed forced and altogether unappealing. She told Jessica as much. Most of the girls, if they want to date, they dated older guys, she said. And you don't have an older guy? Jessica teased. Nah, Charlie said. I figured I'd wait around for our batch to grow up. Right, Jessica burst out laughing before quickly thinking of something to share. Last year, there was this guy, Donnie, she said. I was gaga for him, like, really. He was so sweet to everyone. He wore all black all the time, and he had this black curly hair so thick, all I could think about when I sat behind him was burying my face in it. What is it?
¿Podés tomarte un break?
No. I'm live.
Necesito ir a Aldi con vos. Quiero ir a comprar unas cosas.
I'm sorry. I was so distracted, I ended up with a... Yeah, he's live, yeah. Distracted, I ended up with an A- in trig. He was super artistic, a poet, and carried around one of those black leather notebooks, and he was always scribbling something in it, but he would never show anybody. She sighed dreamingly. I figured if I could get him to show me his poetry, I would really come to know his soul, you know? So did he ever? Charlie said. Oh yeah, she said, nodding empathetically. I asked him out finally, you know, 'cause he was shy and he was never gonna ask me. And we went to the movies and made out a little, and then we went to and hung out on the roof of his apartment building, and I told him all about how I want to study ancient civilizations and go to archaeological digs and stuff, and he showed me his poems. And did you come to know his soul? Charlie said, excited to be included in girl talk, something she felt like she'd never really gotten to participate in before. Charlie nodded eagerly, but not too eagerly. She calmed herself as Jessica scooted forward on the bed to whisper, "The poems were awful. I didn't know it was possible to be both melodramatic and boring at the same time. I mean, like, just reading them made me embarrassed for him." She covered her face in her hands. Charlie laughed. "What did you do? What could I do? I told him it wasn't going to work out and went home." "Wait, right after you read his poetry?" I still had the notebook in my hand. "Oh no, Jessica, that's awful. You must have broken his heart." "I know. I felt so bad, but it was like the words just came out of my mouth. I couldn't stop myself." Did he ever speak to you again?" "Oh yeah, he's perfectly nice. But now he takes statistics and economics and wears sweater vests." "You broke him." Charlie threw a pillow at Jessica, who sat up and caught it. "I know, he'll probably be a millionaire stockbroker instead of a striving artist, and it's all my fault," she grinned. "Come on, he'll thank me someday." Charlie shook her hand. "Do you really want to be an archaeologist?" "Yeah," Jessica said. "Huh? Huh," said Charlie. "Sorry, I thought." She shook her head. "Sorry, that is really cool." "You thought I'd want to do something in fashion?" Jessica said. "Well, yeah, it's okay," Jessica said. "I did too. I mean, I do. I love fashion, but there's only so much to it, you know. I think it's amazing to think about how people lived 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 or 10. They were just like us, but so different. I like to imagine living in other times, other places. Wonder who I would have been. Anyway, what about you?" Charlie rolled over onto her back, looking up at the ceiling. The tiles were made of loose stained styrofoam, and the one above her head was askew. "I hope there aren't any bugs up in there," she thought. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I think it's really cool that you know who you want to be, but I have just never had that kind of a plan." "Well, it's not like you have to figure it out now," Jessica said. "Maybe," Charlie said, "but I don't know. You know what you want to do. John's known since he could hold a pencil that he wanted to be a writer, and he's already getting published. Even Carlton. I don't know what he has planned, but you can just see that there's a scheme brewing behind all his kidding around. I just don't have that kind of direction." "It really doesn't matter," Jessica said. "I don't think most of the people know at our age. Plus, I might change my mind or not get into college or something. You never know what's going to happen. Hey, I'm going to get changed. I want to get some sleep." She went into the bathroom, and Charlie stayed where she was, gazing at the sorry-looking ceiling. She supposed it was becoming a defect, her earnest refusal to consider the past or future. "Live in the present moment," her Aunt Jen said often, and Charlie had taken it to heart. "Don't dwell on the past. Don't worry about things that may never happen." In 8th grade, she had taken a shop class, vaguely hoping the mechanical work might spark something of her father's talent, might unleash some inherent passion lying latent within her, but it had not. She had made a clumsy-looking birdhouse for the backyard. She never took another shop class, and the birdhouse only attracted one squirrel who promptly knocked it down. Jessica came out of the bathroom, wearing pink striped pajamas, and Charlie went in to get ready for bed, changing and brushing her teeth hurriedly. When she came out again, Jessica was already under the covers with the light by her bed turned off. Charlie turned hers off too, but the light from the parking lot still shone in from the window and somehow filtering past the dumpsters. Charlie started up at the ceiling, her hands behind her head. "Do you know what's going to happen tomorrow?" she asked. "I don't really know," Jessica said. "I know it's a ceremony at the school." "Yeah, I know that," Charlie said. "Are we going to have to do anything like do what they want us to speak?" "I don't think so," Jessica said. "Why? Do you want to say something?" No, I was just wondering. Do you ever think about him? Jessica asked. Sometimes I try not to, Charlie said half truthfully. She had sealed off the subject of Michael in her mind, locked him tight behind a mental wall she never touched. It wasn't an effort to avoid the subject, in fact. It was an effort to think about him now. What about you? She asked Jessica. Not really, she said. It's weird, right? Something happens, and it's the worst thing you could ever imagine, and it's just buried into you at the time like it's going to go on forever. And then the years go by and it's just another thing that happened. Not like it's not important or terrible, but it's in the past, just as much as everything else, you know? I guess, Charlie said, but she did know. I just try not to think about those things. Me too, you know? I just went to a funeral last week. I'm sorry, Charlie said, sitting up. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine, Jessica said. I barely even knew him. He was just an old relative who lived 3 states away. I think I met him once, but I hardly remember it. We mostly went for my mom's sake, but it was at an old-fashioned funeral parlor, like in the movies, with an open coffin, and we all walked by the coffin, and when it was my turn, I looked at him, and he could have been sleeping, you know? Just calm and restful, like people always say dead people look. There was nothing that I could have pointed out that made me think dead. If you ask me, every feature of his face looked the same as if he were alive. His skin was the same, his hair was the same as if he were alive. But he wasn't alive, and I just knew it. I would have known it immediately, even if he wasn't, you know, in a coffin. I know what you mean. There is something about them when they're... Charlie said softly. It sounds stupid when I say it, but when I looked at him, he looked so alive, and yet I just knew that he wasn't. It made my skin crawl. That's the worst thing, isn't it? Charlie said. Things that act alive but aren't. What? Jessica said. I mean, things that look alive but aren't, Charlie said, quickly. We should get some sleep, she said. Did you set the alarm? Yes, Jessica said. Good night. Night. Charlie knew sleep was still a long way off. She knew what Jessica meant, probably better than Jessica did. The artificial shine in eyes that followed you as you moved just like a real person's would. The slight lurch of realistic animals who did not move the way a living thing should. The occasional programming glitch that made a robot appear to have done something new creative. Her childhood had been filled with them. She had grown up in the strange gap between life and not life. It had been her world. It had been her father's world. Charlie closed her eyes. What did that world do to him? Alright, we're not done yet, but we just went through 66 pages. Alright, I'm going to read chapter 3, and then I'm going to end the stream. I'm going to read the other chapters later. Not today, but in the future, obviously, because shoot, this might take 2.5 hours. Oh well. Alright, last chapter of the stream, and then we'll continue the story from there later. Chapter 3. Thud, thud, thud. Charlie startled out of the sleep, disoriented. Something was banging on her door, trying to force its way in. Oh, for goodness sake, Jessica said grumpily, and Charlie blinked and sat up. Right, the motel. Hurricane. Someone was knocking on the door. As Jessica went to answer it, Charlie got out of bed and looked at the clock. It was 10 a.m. She looked out the window at the bright new day. She had slept worse than usual. Not nightmares, but dark dreams she could not quite remember. Things that stuck with her just beyond the back of her mind. Images she could not catch. Charlie! Someone was screeching. Charlie went to the door and found herself immediately enveloped in a hug. Marla's plump arms gripping her like a vice. Charlie hugged her back, tighter than she meant to. When Marla let go, she stepped back, grinning. Marla's moods had always been so intense they were contagious, spreading out to whoever was in her path. When she was gloomy, a pall fell over all her friends, the sun gone behind her cloud. When she was happy, like now, it was impossible to avoid the lift of her joy. She was always breathless, always slightly scattered, always giving the impression that she was running late, though she almost never was. Marla was wearing a loose, dark red blouse, and it suited her well, setting off her fair skin and dark brown hair. Charlie had kept in better touch with Marla than the others. Marla was the type who made it easy to stay friends, even at a distance. Even as a little kid, she was always sending letters to post and postcards, undeterred if Charlie didn't respond to every one. She was resolutely positive and assumed that everyone liked her unless they made it clear otherwise. Using the proper expletives, Charlie admired it about her. She herself, though not shy, was always calculating. Does that person like me? Are they just being polite? How do people tell the difference? Marla had come to visit her once when they were 12. She had charmed Charlie's aunt and made fast friends with her school friends, while still making it abundantly clear that she was Charlie's friend and she was there only to see Charlie. Marla's gigantic smiles turned serious as she studied Charlie, peering at her as if trying to spot the differences since they last met. "You're as pale as ever." She took Charlie's hand in her own. You're all clammy. Don't you ever get warm?" She dropped Charlie's hand and proceeded to study the motel room skeptically, as though uncertain exactly what it was. "It's the luxury suite," Jessica said without expression, as she searched for something in her bag. Her hair was sticking up in all directions, and Charlie stifled a smile. It was nice to see something about Jessica in disarray for once. Jessica found her hairbrush and held it up triumphantly. "Ha! Take that, Morning Frizz!" "Come on in," Charlie said, realizing she and Marla were still in the doorway. The door was wide open. Marla nodded. "One sec. Jason!" "Jason!" She shouted out the door. No one emerged. "Jason!" A young boy came trotting up from the road. He was short and weary, darker skinned than his half-sister. His Batman t-shirt and black shorts were made for someone twice his size. His hair was cut close to his head, and his arms and legs were streaked with dirt. "Were you playing in the road?" Marla demanded. "No," he said. "Yes, you were. Don't do that. If you get yourself killed, Mom's gonna blame me. Get inside." Marla shoved her little brother inside and shook her head. How old are you now?" Charlie asked. 11, Jason said. He went to the TV and started fiddling with buttons. "Jason, stop it," Marla said. "Play with your action figures." "I'm not a little kid," he said. "Anyway, they're in the car." But he stepped away from the television and went to look out the window. Marla rubbed his eyes. "We just got here. We had to leave at 6 this morning, and someone," she said pointedly, glancing over her shoulder at Jason, "wouldn't stop fiddling with the radio. I am so tired." She didn't seem tired, but then she never did. At their sleepovers as kids, Charlie remembered her bouncing around like a maniac while the rest of them were winding down for the night, then falling asleep abruptly like a cartoon character who had been hit over the head with a rolling pin. "We should get ready," Jessica said. "We're supposed to meet the guys at the diner in an hour." "Hurry," Marla said. "We have to change too." "I didn't want to get all gross while we were driving." "Jason, you can watch TV," Charlie said, and he looked at Marla. She nodded, and he grinned and turned it on, starting to flip through channels. "Please, just pick a channel," Marla said. Charlie headed into the bathroom to get dressed while Jessica fussed with her hair. A little less than an hour later, they pulled into the diner parking lot. The others were already there, in the same booth they had been in the night before. When they got inside, Marla performed a second round of squeals and hugs, only slightly quieter now that they were in public. Overshadowed by her enthusiasm, Lamar stood and waved at Jessica and Charlie, waiting until Marla sat down. "Hi, guys," he said at last. He was wearing a dark tie and a dark gray suit. He was tall and thin, black with his hair shaved close to his head. His features were sharp and attractive, and he looked just a little older than the rest of them. It could have been the suit, but Charlie thought it was someone It was something about the way he stood, holding himself like he would be comfortable wherever he was. They had all dressed up a little for the ceremony. Marla had changed at the motel, and she and Jessica were both wearing dresses. Jessica's was knee-length and covered in pastel flowers, a light fabric that moved and she walked. Marla's was simple, white with big sunflowers splashed over it. Charlie hadn't thought to bring a dress, and she hoped she didn't look out of place in black pants and a white button-down shirt. John was wearing a light purple shirt today, though he added a matching tie in a slightly darker color. Well, what's so bad about it, Jaden? I don't get it. And Carlton... Wait, let me see. Did I skip? What the hell? And Carlton seemed to be wearing an identical outfit as before, still all in black. They all sat down. Well, don't we all look nice, Marla said happily. Where's Jason? Jessica craned her head from side to side. Marla groaned. I'll be right back. She scooted out of the booth and hurried out the door. Lamar, what have you been up to? Charlie asked. Lamar grinned. He's an Ivy League man, Carlton said, teasing. Lamar looked briefly down at the table, but he was smiling. Early acceptance was all he said. Which one? Jessica said. Colonel. Wait, how did you already apply to college? Charlie said. That's not till next year. I don't even know where I want to go. He skipped 6th grade, John said. There was a brief flicker of something across his face, and Charlie knew what it was. John liked being the clever one, the precocious one. Lamar had been kind of a goof-off when they were kids, and now he had leaped ahead. John forced a grin at the moment passed. Congratulations, he said, with no hint that it was not entirely sincere. Marla came bursting in again, this time towing Jason behind her, holding on to his upper arm. At the hotel, she had made him change into a blazer and khakis as well, though he was still wearing his Nikes. I'm coming, stop it, he whined. Is that Jason? Carlton asked. Yeah, Jason said. Do you remember me? Carlton said. I don't remember any of you, Jason said unapologetically. Sit there, Marla said, pointing to the next booth over. Okay, he grumbled. Marla, he can sit with us, Jessica said. Jason, come on over. I want to sit here, he said, and sat down behind them. He pulled a video game out of his pocket and was oblivious to the world. The waitress came over and they ordered. Marla told her to put Jason's breakfast on their check. When their food came, Charlie checked her watch. Well, we don't have a lot of time, she said. We'll get there, Carlton said. It's not far. A small piece of food fell out of his mouth as he gestured down the road. Have you been back to school? Lamar asked, and Carlton shrugged. I pass it sometimes. I know this is a nostalgia trip for all of you, but I just live here. I don't exactly go around reminiscing about kindergarten all the time. They were all quiet for a second, the beeps and pings of Jason's video game filling the silence. Hey, did you know Lamar's going to Colonel next year? Jessica said to Marla. Really? Well, aren't you ahead of the pack? She said. Lamar looked down at his plate. When he looked up, he was a little flushed. All part of the 5-year plan, he said. They laughed, and his blush deepened. It's kind of weird to be back here, he said, hastily changing the subject. I think it's strange that I'm the only one who still lives here, Carlton said. Nobody ever leaves Hurricane. Is it strange, though? Jessica said thoughtfully. My parents, you remember, my mom's from New York originally. She used to joke about going back. When I go back to New York, but it might as well have been when I win the lottery. She didn't mean it. And then right after she stopped joking about it, then 3 months later, we were all on a plane to visit her sister in Queens. And we never came back. My dad's father died when I was 9, and they came back to Hurricane for the funeral without me. They didn't want me coming back there, and honestly, I didn't want to go. I was kind of anxious the whole time they were gone. I kept looking out the window, hoping they would come back early, like something bad was going to happen to them if they stayed. Alright, Helpy, see you later. They looked at one another, considering. Charlie knew they had all moved, all but Carlton, but she had never thought about it. People moved all the time. Carlton was right, though. People didn't leave Hurricane. We moved because my dad got a new job. The summer after 3rd grade, John said. That's not exactly mysterious, Lamar. You left in the middle of the semester that year. Yeah, he said, but that's because when my parents split, I went to it with my mom to Indianapolis, he frowned. But my dad moved too. He's in Chicago now. My parents left because of Michael, Marla said. They all turned to her. Afterward, my mom couldn't sleep. She said spirits were stirring in the town, unquiet. My dad told her she was being ridiculous, but we still left as fast as we could. Marla looked around at her friends. What? She said defensively. I don't believe in ghosts. Oh, I do, Charlie said. She felt like she was talking from a great distance when she was almost surprised they could hear her. I mean, not ghosts, but memories. I think they linger, whether there's someone there or not. The house, her old house was imbued with memory, with loss, with longing. It hung in the air like humidity. The walls were saturated, like the wood had soaked in it. It had been there before she came, and it was there now. It would be there forever. It had to be. There was too much, too great, and a vast await for Charlie to have brought her with her. That doesn't make any sense, Jessica said. Memory is in our brains, like literally stored in the brain. You can see it on a scan. It can't exist outside of someone's mind. I don't know, John said. Think of all the places that have atmosphere. Old houses, sometimes places where you walk in and you feel sad or nostalgic even though you've never been there before. That's not other people's memories, though, Lamar said. That's subconscious cues, stuff we don't realize we're noticing, that tells us we should feel some way. Peeling paint, old-fashioned furniture, lace curtains, details that tell us to be nostalgic. Mostly things we pick up from movies, probably. I got lost in a carnival when I was 4. I never got so scared in my life, but I don't think anybody's feeling suddenly desperate for their mom when they pass that Ferris wheel. Maybe they are, Marla said. I don't know. Sometimes I have a little moments where it's like there's something I forgot, something I regret, or that I'm happy about, or something that makes me want to cry. But it's only there for a split second, then it's gone. Maybe we're all shedding our fear and regret and hope everywhere we go, and we're catching traces of people we'd never met. Maybe it's everywhere. So, is that different from believing in ghosts? Lamar asked. It's totally different, Marla said. It's not supernatural. And it's not like the souls of dead people. It's just people leaving their mark on the world. So it's the ghosts of living people? Lamar said. No. You're talking about people having some kind of essence that can hang around a specific place after the person is gone, Lamar said. That's a ghost. No, it's not. I'm not saying it right, Marla said. She closed her eyes for a minute, thinking. Okay, she said at last. Do you all remember my grandmother? I do, said Jason. She was my grandmother, too. She was my dad's mom, not yours, Marla said. Anyway, we were only a year old when she died. I do remember her, Jason said quietly. Okay, Marla said. So she collected dolls from the time she was a kid. She and my grandfather used to travel a lot after he retired, and she'd bring them back from all over the world. She had them from France, Egypt, Italy, Brazil, China, everywhere. She kept them in their own special room, and it was full of them. Shelves and shelves of dolls, some tiny and some almost as big as I was. I loved it. One of my earliest memories is playing in that room with dolls, and I remember my dad would always warn me to be careful, and my grandmother would laugh and say, toys should be played with. I had a favorite, a 21-inch red-haired doll in a short, shiny white dress like Shirley Temple. I called her Maggie. She was from the 1940s, and I loved her. I told her everything, and when I was lonely, I would imagine myself in that room playing with Maggie. My grandmother died when I was 6, and my dad and I went to see my grandfather after the funeral. He told me I should pick a doll to keep from the collection. I went to the room to get Maggie, and as soon as I walked through the door, something was wrong. It was as though the light had changed, become darker, harsher than it used to be. I looked around, and the lively, playful poses of the dolls now seemed unnatural, disjointed. It was as though all of them were staring at me. I didn't know what they wanted. Maggie was in the corner, and I took a step toward her, then stopped. I met her eyes, and instead of painted glass, I saw a stranger. I turned and ran. I raced down the hall as though something might be chasing me, not daring to look back until I reached my father's side. He asked if I had picked out a doll, and I just shook my head. I never went back in that room. Huh. Everyone was silent. Charlie was transfixed, still seeing little Marla running for her life. What happened to the dolls? Carlton asked, only half breaking the spell. I don't know. I think my mom sold them to another collector when my grandfather died, Marla said. Sorry, Marla, Lamar said. It's still just tricks of the mind. You missed your grandmother, and you were frightened of death, and dolls are inherently freaky. Charlie broke in, wanting to head off the argument. Is everybody done eating? We have to go soon. We still have plenty of time, Carlton said, looking down at his watch. It's like 5 minutes away. Something else fell out of his mouth, landing next to the first dropped bit of food. John looked around the table from person to person as though he were waiting for something. We have to tell them, he said, looking at Charlie. Oh yeah, we totally do, Jessica said. Tell us what? Jason piped up, peeking over the back of the Marla seat. Shh, Marla said half-heartedly. She was looking at John. Tell us what? John dropped his voice, forcing everyone to lean in closer. Charlie did it too, eager to hear, even though she knew exactly what he was going to say. We went to Freddy's last night, he said. Freddy is still there? Marla exclaimed, too loud. Shh, Jessica said, making frantic hand movements. Sorry, Marla whispered. I just can't believe it's still there. It's not, Carlton said, raising his eyebrows and grinning enigmatically at Lamar. It's hidden, John explained. They were supposed to knock it down to build a mall, but they didn't. They just built around it. Entombed it, John corrected. And you got in? Lamar said. Charlie nodded confirmation. No way. What was it like? Marla asked. Exactly the same, John said. It was like everyone vanished, Charlie said softly. I want to go too. You have to take us, Marla said. Jessica cleared her throat and hesitantly, and they all looked at her. I don't know, she said slowly. I mean, today? Should we? We have to see it, Lamar said. You can't tell us this and not let us see it. I want to see it, Jason chimed in. What's Freddy? What's Freddy's? They ignored him. His eyes were wide and he was hanging on to every word. Maybe Jessica's right, John said with reluctance. Maybe it's disrespectful to go tonight. There was a moment's pause, and Charlie knew that they were waiting for her to talk. She was the one they were really afraid of offending. They needed her permission. I think we should go, she said. I don't think it's disrespectful. It's almost a way of honoring what happened. She looked around the table. Jessica was nodding. Charlie wasn't sure it was much of an argument, but they didn't need to be convinced. They wanted an excuse. Right. Marla twisted herself to look back at Jason's plate. Are you done eating? She asked. Yep, he said. Marla pointed to the game in his hand. You know, you can't play with that during the ceremony, she said. Yep. I'm serious, Jason. I'm locking it in the car. Why don't you just lock me in the car? He muttered. I'd love to, Marla said under her breath, and she turned back to the group. Okay, we can go. They headed to the school in a caravan, the boys in Carlton's car, Marla following, and Charlie bringing up the rear. We should have carpooled, Jessica said idly, staring out the window. It hadn't occurred to Charlie, I guess, she said. On the other hand, I'm not sure I want to ride with Marla and Jason, Jessica said plainly. They are kind of intense, Charlie agreed. When they arrived, the parking lot was already jammed full. Charlie parked on a side street in what she hoped was a legal spot, and they walked to the school along the familiar sidewalk. Jessica shivered. I've got goosebumps. Is it weird to be here? Charlie said. The school looked unchanged from the outside, but the fence was new and slick and a black plastic-coated chain link. The whole town was like this, a mix of old and new, familiar and not. The things that had changed seemed out of place, and the things that had remained the same made Charlie feel out of place. It must be so strange for Carlton to live here, she thought. I know this is a nostalgia trip for all of you, but I just live here, he had said. Somehow Charlie was not sure she believed that. When they got to the playing field behind the school, the bleachers were already full. Rows of folding chairs had been laid out in front of them to add more seating, and Charlie spotted Marla and the boys at the front. Oh, great, she said. I don't want to sit in the front row. Oh, great, she said. I don't want to sit in the front row. I don't mind, Jessica said. Charlie looked at her. Of course you don't, she wanted to say. You're you. Yeah, she said instead. No big deal. Half the town must be there, she observed as they made their way to the group where 2 seats had been saved. There was one open in the front row next to Carlton, and one right behind it, beside Marla. Jessica winked at Charlie and sat down next to Carlton. She leaned toward him, and they started whispering. Charlie repeated to herself to Marla, There's a lot of people here. Yeah, Marla said. It's a small town, you know. It's a small town, you know. Michael's, it was a big deal. Plus, his parents still live here. People remember. People remember, Charlie echoed softly. There was a small raised stage set up in front of them with a podium and 4 chairs. Behind the chairs, and a screen was suspended. Projected on it was a larger-than-life picture of Michael. It was a close-up, just his face. It was not the most flattering picture. His head was thrown back at an odd angle, his mouth open in laughter. But it was perfect. A joyful moment, snatched up and kept, not curated. He looked happy. Darn it, Marla said softly. Charlie looked at her. She was dabbing at her eye with a tissue. Charlie put an arm around her. I know, she said. The sound system came on suddenly with a whine that slowly faded. 4 people walked on stage. A heavy-set man in a suit who went straight into the microphone, an elderly woman, and a man and a woman. The man in the suit stepped up to the podium, and the elderly woman sat down in one of the 4 chairs. The couple stayed back, but they did not sit. Charlie knew they must be Michael's parents, but she did not recognize them. When she was young, they had just been parents, a species that was, for the most part, unremarkable. She realized suddenly that she didn't even know their names. Michael's parents had not gone out of their way to interact with their son's friends, and Charlie had literally spoken to them as Michael's mom and Michael's dad, as if those were appropriate forms of address. The man at the podium introduced himself as the school's principal. He said a few things about loss and community and the fleeting preciousness of youth. He talked briefly about Michael's kindness, his artistic talent, and the impression he made, even as a small child, on everyone he met. It was true, Charlie reflected. Michael had been an unusually charismatic child. He wasn't exactly a leader, but they all found themselves wanting to please him, to make him smile, and so they often did the things they knew he wanted to do, just to make him happy. The principal finished and introduced Michael's parents, Joan and Donald Brooks. They stood at the podium awkwardly, each looking from face to face in the crowd as if they were not sure how they had gotten here. Finally, Joan stepped forward. It feels strange to be up here, was the first thing she said, and a murmur of something like agreement swept quietly through the crowd. We are so grateful to all of you for coming, especially those of you who came from out of town. She looked directly at the front row, talking to Charlie and the others. Some of Michael's friends have come from all over, and I think that is a testament to who he was that 10 years later, with your lives on new paths, moving on to a whole new stage of life, so close to the stage, Charlie could see she was about to cry, tears wavering in her eyes, but her voice was steady. We are grateful you are here. We wanted to give Michael a legacy with this scholarship, but it is clear that he has already left one all on his own. Marla grabbed Charlie's hand and Charlie squeezed back. I want to say, Joan continued, something about the families who are not here. As we all know, Michael was not the only child lost during those terrible few months. She read out what? She read out 4 more names, 2 girls and 2 boys. Charlie glanced at Marla. They all knew there had been other children, but not Michael's death had loomed so great in all their lives that they had never even talked about the other victims. Now Charlie felt a pang of guilt. To someone those little girls and boys had been as vital as Michael, to someone their losses had meant to the end of the world, she closed her eyes for a moment. I can't mourn everyone, she thought. No one can. Joan was still talking. Although their families have moved on to other places, those young boys and girls will always have a place in our hearts. Now, I would like to call to speak a young man who was practically close to my son. Carlton, if you would. They all watched in surprise as Carlton stood and climbed up behind the podium. Joan hugged him and stayed close behind him as he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He cleared his throat, looking over the heads of the crowd. They crumpled the paper up again and put it back in his pocket. I don't remember as much about Michael as I should, he said finally. Too much of those years is a blur. I know we met when we were still in diapers, but I don't remember that, thankfully. There was a soft titter through the crowd. I don't know that as far back as I have memories. Michael is in them. I remember playing superheroes, drawing which he was better at than me, and as we got older, I remember, playing superheroes and drawing. What I really remember, though, is that my days were always more exciting when he was in them. He was smarter than me. He was the one always coming up with new ideas, new ways to get in trouble. Sorry about those lamps, by the way, Mrs. Brooks. If I had jumped in the way, Michael said, I probably would have only broken one. Donald laughed, a gulping, desperate sound. Charlie shifted uncomfortably and pulled her hand from Marla's with an apologetic half-smile. Their grief naked was too much to watch. It was raw and open wound, and she could not stand to look. Carlton came back down to sit with them. Michael's grandmother spoke. And then his father, who had recovered enough to share a memory of taking his son to his first art class. He told the crowd about the scholarship for a graduating senior who has demonstrated both excellence and passion in the arts and announced the winner of the first one, Ann Park, a slight Korean girl who came quickly up to the stage to accept her plaque and hugs from Michael's parents. It must have been strange for Anne. Charlie thought her honor so overshadowed by its origin. But then she realized Anne must have known Michael too, however much in passing. After the ceremony, they went to say hello to Michael's parents, hugging them and making sounds of condolence. What do you say to someone who has lost a child? Can it be any easier? Can 10 years make a difference, or do they wake up each morning as fresh with grief as the day he died? On a long cafeteria table by the stage, pictures and cards were collecting slowly. People had brought flowers, notes to Michael's parents, or to him. Things they remembered, things they wished they had said. Charlie went over and browsed through the notes. There were pictures of her and the others as well as of Michael. It shouldn't have surprised her. They were all together constantly as a group in rotating groups of 2 and 3. She saw herself in the middle of a pose. Michael, John, and she, all covered in mud, with Jessica beside them, still perfectly clean, refusing to go near them. Charlie smiled. That looks about right. A 5-year-old Marla struggled to support the weight of her newborn little brother, with Lamar peering suspiciously at the tiny thing over her shoulder. Some of Michael's drawings were there too. Crayon scribbles professionally encourageously framed. Charlie picked one up, a drawing of what she supposed was a T-Rex stomping through a city. It was actually, she realized now, almost amazing how talented he was. While she and the others were scribbling stick figures, Michael's drawing looked realistic, sort of. That's really good, John said over her shoulder. Charlie startled. You scared me, she said. Sorry. Charlie looked back at the drawing. Whatever it was better than she could draw now. Suddenly her chest tightened and gripped with a loss and rage. It wasn't just that Michael died young. It was what that truly meant. He had been stopped in his tracks, years, decades of life snatched and torn violently from him. She felt herself well up with youthful indignation, as if she were a child again, wanting only to whine, "It's not fair." Taking a deep breath, Charlie set the picture back down on the table and turned away. The gathering was continuing, but she needed to leave. She caught Marla's eye, and Marla, as scarily intuitive as always, nodded and caught Lamar's sleeve. From their various vantage points, they all headed for the parking lot. No one seemed to notice their departure, which made sense, except for Carlton. They were all strangers here. In the lot, they stopped by Marla's car. She had somehow called down a miracle and found a space right next to the school. "Can I play my game now?" Jason said immediately, and Marla found her keys in her purse and handed them over. "Don't drive away," she warned. Suddenly, Marla grabbed her brother and pulled him close, hugging him to her for a long minute. "Geez, I'm only going to the car," he muttered when she let him go. Ugh, I'm spinning all over this book. Sheesh. "Yeah, maybe I should let you drive away," she said, giving him a little push. She cleared her throat. "So, are we going to Freddy's?" she said. They all looked at one another. "Yeah," Charlie said. "I think we should." Somehow, following this, going back to Freddy seemed like more than a game. It felt right. "Let's meet there at sunset," she said. "Hey, Jessica, can you catch a ride with the guys or something? I'm gonna go for a walk." "You can come with us," Marla said. "I promised Jason I'd take him to the movies." Charlie headed down the road without waiting to hear the rest of the discussion. A dozen feet from the lot, she realized she was being followed. She turned around. "John? Do you mind if I come? You're going to your old house, right? How do you know that? It's the only interesting thing out this way. Anyway, I went to see my old place too. It was painted blue and there was a garden in the yard. It was weird. I know it wasn't blue when I lived there, but I couldn't remember what color it was supposed to be. Everything's so different." Charlie didn't say anything. She wasn't even sure she wanted John to come with her. Her house, her father's house, it was private. She thought of the first time John had seen the toys, his fascination and interest that was all his, that had nothing to do with pleasing her. She relented. "Okay, well, you can come." Is it? He hesitated. "Is it different?" "It's really not," Charlie said. It wasn't quite true, but she wasn't sure how to explain the thing that had changed. They walked together for the better part of 3 miles, away from town and down old roads, first paved, then gravel. As they neared the place, they left the roads, ascending the steep incline of a hill, overrun with brush and trees that should have been trimmed or cut down ages ago. 3 rooftops peeked over the leaves, scattered widely over the hill, but no one had lived in these houses in a long time. At last they walked up the driveway, and John stopped short, staring at the house. I thought it would be less intimidating," he said softly. Impatient, Charlie took his arm for a second and pulled him away, leading them around the side of the house. It was one thing for him to be here with her, but she was not quite ready to let someone else inside. She wasn't even sure she wanted to go inside again anyway. He followed her without protest, as if aware they were in her territory and she would decide where they went. The property was large, more than a lawn. There were woods surrounding the wide space of the backyard, and as a child, Charlie had often felt like she was in her own little realm, ruler of all she surveyed. The grass had gone wild, weeds growing feral and up to their knees. They walked the perimeter. John peered into the woods, and Charlie was struck by her old childhood fear, like something out of a fairy tale. "Don't go into the woods alone, Charlotte," her father warned. It was not sinister, just a parent's warning. Don't get lost. Like telling her not to cross the street without holding someone's hand or not to touch the stove when it was hot. But Charlie took it more seriously. She knew from her storybooks, as all children did, that the woods contained wolves and more dangerous things. She caught John's sleeve. "Don't," she said, and he pulled back from the woods, not asking why. Instead, he went to a tree in the middle of the yard and put a hand on it. "Remember that tree?" he asked, smiling, something a little wicked in his voice. "Of course," Charlie said, walking over. "It's been here longer than I ever was." But he was looking at her, waiting for more, and suddenly she remembered. It had been on a sunny day, springtime. They were 6 years old, maybe. John was visiting, and they were playing hide-and-seek, half supervised by Charlie's father, who was in his garage workshop, absorbed in his machines. The door was open, so he would notice if someone screamed, but short of that, the outdoors was their own. John counted to 10, eyes covered, facing the tree that was their home base. The yard was wide and open. There were not many places to hide, so Charlie, buoyed up by the excitement of the game, dared to hide beyond the forbidden edge of the woods, just barely past the tree line. John searched for the other places first, behind her father's car, in the corner where one part of the garage jutted out, the space beneath the porch where a child could just barely crawl. He realized where she must have been, and Charlie braced herself to run as he began to walk the edges of the yard, darting into the woods and out again, looking behind the trees. When at last he found her, she took off, tearing across the lawn to the home base tree. He was just behind her, so close he could almost touch her, and she sped on, staying out of reach. She hit the tree, almost slamming into it, and John was right behind her, bumping into her a second later. Not too fast to stop. They were both giggling hysterically, and then they stopped at the same moment, still gasping to catch their breath. "Hey, Charlotte," John said, stressing her name in the mocking tone he always used. "Don't call me that," Charlie said automatically. "You ever seen grown-ups kiss?" He picked up a stick and started digging at a tree bark, like he was more interested in that than in her answer. Charlie shrugged. "Yes, I guess so. Want to try it?" He still wasn't looking at her. His face was streaked with dirt, like it often was, and his hair was sticking out in all directions. A twig caught in it above his forehead. "Gross," Charlie said, wrinkling her nose. Then, after a moment, "Yeah, okay." John dropped the stick and leaned forward to her, his hands behind his back. Charlie closed her eyes, waiting, still not entirely sure what she's supposed to do. "Charlotte!" It was her father. Charlie jumped back. John's face was so close to hers that she banged into him with her forehead. "Ow!" he yelled, clapping a hand to his nose. Charlie's father came around the side of the tree. What are you up to, John?" He peered John's finger away from his nose. "You're not bleeding. You'll be fine," he said. "Charlotte, closer to the house, please." Then he pointed his finger, directing them forward. "John, it looks like your mom is here anyway." He walked ahead of them toward the driveway where her car had just pulled in. "Yeah, okay." John trotted off toward the driveway, turning once to wave at Charlie. He was grinning like something wonderful had happened, although Charlie was not quite sure what it was. "Oh my," Charlie said, now covering her face, sure it was bright red. When she looked up again, John was grinning that same satisfied 6-year-old grin. "You know, my nose still hurts when it rains," he said, touching a finger to it. "It does not," Charlie said. She leaned back against the tree. "I can't believe you tried to kiss me. We were 6. Charlie stared at him accusingly. Even the littlest heart wants what it wants. John said in a mock romantic voice, but there was an edge of something real in it, something not well enough hidden. Charlie realized suddenly that he was standing very close to her. "Let's go see your dad's workshop," John said abruptly too loud, and Charlie nodded. Okay, she regretted it as she said it. She did not want to open the workshop door. She closed her eyes, still leaning against the tree. She could still see it. It was all she could see when she thought of that place. The twitching, malformed metal skeleton in its dark corner, with its wrenching shutters and its blistering silver eyes. The image welled up in her head until it was all there was. The memory radiated a cutting anguish, but she did not know who it belonged to the thing, to her father, or to herself. Charlie felt a hand over her shoulder and opened her eyes. It was John, frowning at her like he was worried. "Charlie, are you okay?" "No." "Yes," she said. "Come on, let's go see what's inside the house. The workshop." It was not locked, and there was no real reason it should be, Charlie thought. Her eyes went first to the dark corner. The figure was not there. There was a weathered apron hanging in its place, the one her father had worn for soldering, and his goggles next to it. But there was no sign of that uncanny presence. Charlie should have felt it relieved, but she didn't. Only a vague unease. She looked around. There seemed to be almost nothing left of the workshop. The benches were there where her father had assembled and tweaked his inventions, but the materials, the blueprints, and the half-finished robots that were once crammed into every surface had disappeared. Where are they? Had her aunt had them carted away to a junkyard to rust and crumble among other discarded useless things? Or had her father done it himself, so no one else would have to? The concrete floor was littered here and there with scraps. Whoever had done the cleanup had not been thorough. Charlie knelt and picked up an oddly shaped scrap of wood, then a small circuit board. She turned it over. Whose brain were you? She wondered. But it did not matter. Not really. It was battered and worn, the etched copper too badly scratched to repair, even if someone wanted to. "Charlie?" John said from across the workshop. He was in the dark corner. If the skeleton had been there, it could have reached out to touch him. "But it's not there." "What?" "Come see what I found." I think I know what it is." Charlie went. John was standing beside her father's toolbox, and he stepped away as she came over, giving her space. Charlie knelt down before it and looked as if it had just been polished. It was made of dark-stained wood, glossy with some kind of lacquer. She opened it gently. Charlie picked it up and all from the top tray and held it for a moment. The rounded wooden handle fitting into the palm of her hand as if it had been made for her to use. Not that she knew how. The last time she had picked it up, she could barely fit her fingers around its base. She picked up the tools one after another, lifting them from their places. The toolbox had wooden spaces carved out to fit the precise shape of each item. All the tools were polished and clean, their wooden handles smooth and their metal unrusted. They looked as though they had been used just that morning, wiped down and put away meticulously, like someone still cared for them. She looked at them with a fierce, unexpected joy, as if something she had fought for was returned to her. But her joy felt wrong, misplaced. Looking at her father's things set her off balance. Something in the world was not as it should be. Seized suddenly with an unfounded fear, she thrust the awl back into its place in the box, dropping it like something burning. She closed the lid, but she did not stand. Memory overtook her, and she closed her eyes, not fighting against it. Her feet were wedged in the dirt, and two large and callous hands covered her eyes. Suddenly there was a bright light, and Charlie squinted, squirming impatiently to see what was before her. 3 complete and gleaming figures towering over her, motionless, the sun reflecting off every edge and contour. They were blinding to behold. "What do you think?" She heard the question but could not answer it. Her eyes hadn't adjusted. The 3 masses of standing metal looked all all looked similar in their structure, but Charlie had grown accustomed to seeing more than was there. Imagining the final result, for a long time now, there had been 3 empty suits, hanging like carcasses from a rafter in the attic. Charlie knew that they had a special purpose, and now she understood what that was. 2 long beams protruded from the top of the head of one of the hulking masses. The head itself was solid and skull-like. The beams looked as if they had been violently thrust there. "That's the rabbit," Charlie squealed, proud of herself. "You aren't scared of him? You aren't scared of him?" the voice asked. "Of course not. He looks like Theodore." Theodore, that's right. The figure was in the middle. The figure in the middle was more clearly rendered. Its face was chiseled, its features distinct. It was clearly a bear, and a single metal beam stuck out from the top of its head as well. Charlie was puzzled for a moment, then smiled. "For the top hat? For the top hat. For the top hat," she said with confidence. The last form was perhaps the most frightening. A long metal clamp protruded from its empty face in the place of where a mouth might go. It was holding something on a platter, a metal structure that looked like a jaw, wires running like strewn spaghetti up and down the frame and in and out of its sockets. "That one's scary," she admitted hesitantly. This part will look like a cupcake." Her father pressed down on the top, and the jaw snapped shut, making Charlie jump then giggle. Suddenly her laughter stopped. She had been so distracted she'd forgotten. "I'm not supposed to stand here. I don't stand here." Her hands were trembling. How could she have forgotten? The corner. She looked at the ground, unable to lift her eyes, unable to move. One of her shoes was untied. There was a screw next to her foot and an old piece of tape, opaque with dirt. There was something behind her. "Charlie?" It was John. "Charlie!" She looked up at him. "Sorry, just lost. This place." She stood and took a step forward, positioning herself in the place she remembered. She glanced behind her as if the memory might manifest. The corner was empty. There was nothing. She knelt again and put her hand on the ground, fishing around until she found a small screw in the bare dirt. She palmed it, then looked closer. There were small holes in the ground, exposed when she moved the loose dirt. Charlie ran her fingers through them thoughtfully. "Charlie, I have to tell you something." There was something urgent in John's voice. Charlie looked around the workshop and stood up. "Can we go outside?" she said. "I can't breathe in here." "Yeah, of course," he said. He followed her out into the yard and back to the hide-and-seek tree. She was tired and wrung out. A wrung out exhaustion deep inside. She would be fine in a minute, but she wanted a place that held only silly childhood memories. She sat down in the grass, leaned against the trunk, and waited for John to talk. He settled himself cross-legged in front of her, a little stiffly, smoothing his pants, and she laughed. "Are you worried about getting dirty? Times change," he said, with a wry smile. "What do you have to tell me?" she asked, and his face grew serious. I should have said something a long time ago," he said. When something happened like that, you don't trust your memory. You don't trust your own mind." "What are you talking about?" Charlie asked. "Sorry," he took a deep breath. I saw someone that night, the night Michael disappeared." "What do you mean? Remember when we were sitting at the table by the stage and the animals started going crazy?" "No frickin' way." "I remember," Charlie said. "It had been bizarre, their movements upsetting. They were moving too fast, bending and spinning, cycling through their limited programmed moves over and over. They seemed frantic, panicked. Charlie was mesmerized. She should have been afraid of them, but she was not. She saw in their juddering motion a kind of desperation. She was reminded for a moment of dreams of running dreams when the world depended on her going just 10 steps forward, yet her body could only move in slow motion. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Chaotically, violently, the animatronic animals on stage thrashed thrashed robotic limbs in all directions, their eyes rolling in their sockets. What did you see? Charlie said to John now, shaking her head as though she could rid it of the image. There was another mascot, he said. A bear. Freddy? Freddy, Charlie interrupted without thinking. No, not Freddy. John took her hand as if trying to calm them both. But he let go before he spoke again. It was standing right near us, next to our table, but it wasn't looking at the stage like everyone else was. That technician came over, remember? And even he was just watching the animatronics. I guess he was trying to figure out what was happening. I looked over at the mascot, and it looked back at me. He stopped. John, what? Charlie said impatiently. Then the animatronics on stage stopped moving, and I looked over at them. When we all turned back around, Michael was gone, and so was the mascot. I think I know what happened. Charlie stared at him at disbelief. You saw the kidnapper? You saw the kidnapper, she said. I didn't know what I saw, John said. It was all chaos. I didn't even think about it. I didn't make the connection. It was just another animal at Freddy's. Almost done. I didn't think about it who might have been inside it. I was a kid, you know? You figure that the grown-ups already know everything, you know? Yeah, Charlie said. I know. Do you remember anything what the person looked like? Johnny was staring up at the sky as if he were seeing something Charlie could not. Yes, he said. His voice was deliberate, steady. The eyes, they were all I could see, but I still see them sometimes. Like they're right in front of me. They were dead. What? They were dead, just dull and flat, like they still moved and blinked and saw, but whatever was behind them had died a long time ago. He fell silent. It was growing dark. There was a bright, almost unnatural streak of pink across the western sky, and Charlie shivered. We should go get the car, she said. It's almost time to meet everyone. Yeah, John said, but he didn't move right away, still staring into the distance. John, we have to go, Charlie said. He seemed to come back to himself slowly. Yeah, he said. We should go. He got up and brushed off his pants, then grinned at Charlie. Race you? He said, and took off running. Charlie chased after him, her feet pounding the asphalt and her arms swinging free. Holy crap! Let me see. How many chapters should I read next time? You know what? I should read the next 3 chapters in the next stream. Well, those were chapters 1, 2, and 3. Well, things are getting interesting. So, hopefully I'll finish reading the book before the end of October. And all I gotta say is thank you for watching and listening. And I'll see you next time.